The scandal never began with a scream. It began with a scent sharp, cold, and deceptively clean, drifting through velvet-draped parlors where London's finest gathered to congratulate themselves on their restraint. Ether curled through the air like a polite ghost, hiding beneath perfumes of rose-water and violet powder, slipping between champagne laughter and trembling gloved hands. In these drawing rooms of silk and shadow, the city's most respectable women learned how to float, how to drift, how to forget, and how to depend on the bottle tucked discreetly in a silver-lined drawer. Servants whispered about sudden mood changes, late-night tremors, and ladies who fainted too easily at the opera. Doctors, reputable men in polished boots, assured them it was simply exhaustion, nerves, or the modern pace of life. And so the droplets continued to fall onto lace handkerchiefs, onto porcelain cups, onto lips that feared their own hunger. No one admitted the truth aloud. London's upper crust was quietly inhaling itself into oblivion. Tonight we open the door they kept locked. Subscribe and stay close. Tell me where you're listening from, because the sweet, drifting fog only gets darker from here. The trouble began, as most Victorian troubles did, with a fainting spell that everyone pretended was charming. It happened on a late spring afternoon, when London's air was thick with chimney soot and magnolia perfume drifting from Hyde Park. At Lady Dalrymple's garden luncheon, a spectacle of ivory parasols and pale cucumber sandwiches, the heat pressed gently against corseted ribs, and polite laughter floated above the clink of silver. It was there, beneath the trimmed hedges and fluttering silk fans, that Mrs. Eleanor Ashmore's hand began to tremble. At first, no one noticed. Trembling, after all, was practically fashionable among women of her circle, a sign of delicacy, refinement, sensitivity to the world's harsher breezes. But then the fan, a lacquered thing of painted lilies and mother-of-pearl, slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the grass. Eleanor's eyes widened, not in surprise but in dread, as though something deeper than embarrassment had been revealed. A second later, she swayed, the edges of her vision blurring into a slow, swirling haze. The world felt distant, muffled, as though wrapped in velvet. Lady Dalrymple gasped in the precise way society demanded, softly, elegantly, just enough to show concern without wrinkling her powdered brow. Chairs scraped, gloves reached out. Eleanor collapsed into the arms of two very alarmed debutantes, her body weightless, her breath tinged with a sweetness utterly foreign to the garden around her. But the scent did not go unnoticed. A servant boy, carrying a tray of lemonade glasses, paused as he passed by, his brow knitting. He sniffed the air again to be sure something sharp, almost medicinal, hung around the fainted woman like a pale mist. Before he could linger, he was shooed away, told that servants had no business interfering in matters of female constitution. They carried Eleanor inside, lowering her onto a chaise beneath a portrait of an unsmiling ancestor in naval uniform. The drawing-room smelled of lavender polish and old rugs, but beneath it all lingered that same sweetness, thin, chemical, unsettling. The ladies attending her whispered that it must be the heat, the corsetry, the stress of hosting so many invitations this season. Anything at all except the truth, because the truth sat hidden in her reticule, a small glass bottle with a blue label, one that glimmered faintly whenever her trembling fingers reached for it. She had uncorked it only minutes before stepping into the garden, just a small inhalation, a tiny drift of cool vapor to settle her nerves. The doctor had said it would help her sleep, then help her appetite, then help her spirits. And when she found herself taking it for nothing at all, he merely nodded and wrote another prescription with that same professional smile. As Eleanor stirred on the chaise, her eyelids fluttering open, the room around her shifted into clarity, though not the kind she longed for. Everything felt too bright, too sharp, too real in the wrong places. She reached instinctively for her reticule, fingertips brushing the smooth glass inside. Just to steady herself, she told her mind, just to keep the world from tilting again. Outside, Lady Dalrymple declared to her guests that poor Mrs. Ashmore simply needed rest. Nothing serious, nothing worth gossiping about. Yet already, soft murmurs drifted beneath parasols. Observant eyes noticed the pallor of Eleanor's cheeks, the faint chemical sweetness still lingering in the air. They had smelled something similar before in hospitals, in surgical rooms, in stories told by nurses with guarded expressions. But none dared speak the word aloud. Ether. In that moment, beneath chandeliers, beside breathless whispers, and behind the façade of gentility, the first crack appeared in the polished shell of Victorian high society. A crack small enough to ignore but sharp enough to cut. The bottle behind the fan, still cooling in Eleanor Ashmore's purse, would soon become the quiet companion of far too many women who believed themselves untouchable. And the city, watching from behind lace curtains and gaslit windows, had no idea that its most elegant citizens were already beginning to drift. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow was known across Mayfair for two things: his impeccable punctuality and his remarkably calm smile. It was the kind of smile that reassured nervous mothers, soothed anxious husbands, and convinced ladies of delicate constitution that everything troubling them could be corrected with a quiet word and a small glass bottle. His consulting rooms on Bruton Street were tastefully spare, polished oak, a brass-tipped cane stand, Turkish rugs muted in colour, nothing dramatic enough to unsettle. Only the faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, softened by rose pomade and the distant hum of carriage wheels passing outside. It was into this tranquillity that Mrs. Eleanor Ashmore stepped the morning after her fainting spell, wrapped in a pale shawl and escorted by her husband's butler. Her hands were steadier than they had been the day before, but not entirely. Enough to draw Dr. Harrow's attention, not enough to provoke his alarm. "My dear Mrs. Ashmore," he said, rising with that familiar, polished smile, "I hear yesterday was rather trying." Eleanor attempted a laugh, but it wavered. "The heat was beastly, Doctor." "Ah, yes," he replied gently, gesturing for her to sit. "Heat, excitement, heavy corsetry. London conspires against its ladies in the spring." He folded his hands, fingertips pressed lightly together. "And how is your sleep?" Eleanor hesitated. The slightest flicker crossed her eyes. "Uneven," she admitted softly. "The nights grow long. My mind wanders." "Of course it does." The doctor's smile brightened just so. "Modern life expects too much of refined nerves. But fortunately, we have remedies." He reached for a drawer in his desk, smooth oak, worn by years of careful handling, and withdrew a familiar bottle, blue label, clear glass, a scent that waited beneath the cork like a secret trying to escape. Eleanor exhaled shakily, part relief, part shame. Dr. Harrow noticed both. He always did. "You mustn't think anything of it," he said, setting the bottle between them like a peace offering. "Ether vapor has assisted many of my most distinguished patients. A drop or two at night, or during times of emotional strain, has been known to soothe even the most burdened mind." Eleanor swallowed. Her fingers twitched toward her reticule, remembering the bottle hidden there. Remembering how it helped, how it wrapped the edges of the world in softness, how it made her feel briefly unburdened. "But doctor," she whispered, eyes lowered, "I fear I may rely on it too often." For the first time, his smile faltered not with concern, but with a kind of professional patience. "Rely," he repeated. "My dear, one cannot rely on a tonic. It is merely a support, a modern convenience. Think of it as you would a corset stay or a carriage wheel, something to keep you upright when life becomes tiring. But it feels," she hesitated, voice trembling, "it feels as though I am drifting." "Precisely the point," he said soothingly. "The mind cannot remain taut forever. Ether allows it rest. Would you deny rest to your own husband? Your children?" Eleanor fell silent. Outside, footsteps passed on the pavement. A carriage clattered by. A child laughed in the distance. All of it felt too sharp, too immediate. She longed for the soft blur of yesterday's clouded edges, the hush that fell over her thoughts when the vapor touched her lips. Dr. Harrow leaned back slightly, observing the internal debate he knew he'd already won. London is changing, Mrs. Ashmore. Expectations grow heavier. You must allow yourself a little mercy. He slid the bottle toward her. She took it. Her fingers closed around the glass with unmistakable familiarity, and the doctor's steady smile returned, polished, gentle, and utterly untroubled. As Eleanor left his rooms, shawl gathered close. The scent of ether clung to her gloves like an invisible stain. The butler helped her into the carriage, unaware of the fragile bottle tucked once more into her handbag, unaware that the line between remedy and dependence had thinned to almost nothing. Dr. Harrow watched from his window as the carriage rolled away into the London fog. He folded his hands behind his back, exhaling slowly. Another patient soothed, another nervous mind settled. Behind him, in the quiet office, the drawer still stood ajar, revealing rows of identical bottles, their blue labels catching the morning light like a row of sleeping eyes. And the city outside continued its gentle hum, blissfully unaware that its most respectable households now carried within them the first cold breath of a new addiction. The powder room at Lady Hardwicke's soiree was not truly a room at all, but a gilded alcove draped in mauve silk, lit by gas lamps, softened through frosted glass. It was a refuge from the noise of violins and laughter drifting from the ballroom, a place where women sought momentary escape from corsets, conversation, and the relentless scrutiny of society. But on this particular evening, it became something else entirely, a confessional, a sanctuary, and a quiet exchange of forbidden comforts. A quartet of ladies clustered near the marble washstand, their gowns shimmering under the hazy glow. Their voices were low, sweetened with the conspiratorial intimacy that only secrets can evoke. Miss Clairford, the youngest of them, dabbed rose powder along her cheekbones with a trembling hand. She prayed no one noticed. "Good heavens, Clara," murmured Lady Montrose, leaning in with a gloved hand poised dramatically at her throat. "You're shaking." Clara froze. "It's nothing," she whispered, forcing a smile. "Only nerves." The others exchanged knowing glances, not cruel, but curious, for they too had seen such tremors before. Lady Montrose moved closer, her perfume a heavy melange of jasmine and bergamot. "Darling, it's the season. We're all overwhelmed." This was true. The London season devoured stamina like a great machine. Soirees spilling into midnight, fittings at dawn, teas where one must appear effortlessly radiant, while the city pressed upon one's lungs like a fog. Clara had felt herself fading, her mind turning brittle under the weight of expectation. But it wasn't merely exhaustion that plagued her. It was the bottle hidden in her reticule, small, glass, with a blue label that seemed to pulse in her imagination like a heartbeat. She had first used it weeks ago, at her mother's urging. "Just a tiny inhalation," her mother had said, touching the cork to Clara's lips as though offering communion. To steady the nerves. It had slipped into Clara's life as easily as a new ribbon or a fashionable perfume. She had not expected it to stay. Tonight, however, she was not alone in her quiet reliance. Lady Montrose drew closer, lowering her voice to a whisper soft enough to blend into the silk curtains around them. "Clara, my dear," she murmured, "you are among friends." Her gloved fingers brushed Clara's wrist with gentle pressure. "Tell me, does your doctor also prescribe vapor?" Clara stiffened. I don't know what you mean." But Lady Montrose smiled with the poised confidence of a woman who had uncovered far more delicate secrets. "My dear, we all know the scent." At this, the third woman, Mrs. Whitcomb, lifted her chin slightly. Her eyes glinted under the lamplight. "You're safe to speak. she added. "Truly, it helps us as well." A pause, a breath. Then the powder room fell into a strange, suspended silence, the kind that precedes either danger or communion. Clara exhaled, shoulders trembling with relief or fear, she could not tell which. "You use it too?" she whispered. A soft chorus of nods. Lady Montrose slipped her hand into her jeweled clutch and withdrew a familiar bottle, blue label catching light like a secret candle flame. "For evenings like this," she said delicately, "when one must be charming, and awake, and utterly untroubled." Mrs. Whitcomb's lips curved into a wistful smile. "We share it among ourselves, a drop in the powder room, a breath before rejoining the dance." She glanced toward the curtained entrance to ensure no one approached. "It smooths the edges of the evening." Clara stared at the bottle, pulse quickening. The air around them seemed to tighten, the scent of perfume blending with a faint sweetness she now recognized too well. Lady Montrose extended the bottle toward her. "If you're feeling faint," she said gently, "just a touch will steady you." Clara's fingers hovered. Just beyond the silk curtain, the orchestra swelled, couples spinning under chandeliers, laughter rising like champagne bubbles. Yet here, in this tiny, velvety alcove, another world existed, one of fragile nerves, shared indulgences, and whispered truths, spoken only when the gas lamps burned low. Clara took the bottle. The ladies exchanged the kind of smile only those bound by a quiet vice can share, a mixture of relief, camaraderie, and something darker. Outside, the music shimmered on. Inside the powder room, the sweet scent of ether drifted into the air like an invisible pact, a pact that, by morning, none would confess to having made. But all would remember. London had a way of swallowing scents: coal smoke, horse sweat, damp brickwork, and the metallic tang of the Thames, blending them into a single, heavy breath the city exhaled over its citizens. But that night, as the carriages rolled out from Grosvenor Square and the lamps flickered behind lace-curtained windows, a stranger fragrance drifted into the streets. Sweet, cool, chemical. A scent that did not belong to the night, yet seemed to rise from it like a pale ghost. It began at the Ashmore residence, where Eleanor, newly returned from Lady Hardwicke's soirée, stepped out onto her balcony in hopes that the open air might clear her mind. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the wind lifted her hair and carried with it the city's familiar symphony of sounds, distant wheels, muffled laughter, a lamplighter's whistle. But underneath it all lingered that other smell, the one Dr. Harrow dismissed so casually, the one her friends whispered about behind silk fans. She had only taken the smallest inhalation before bed, just enough to quiet the hum of her thoughts, but it clung to her still, curling up from her skin with the persistence of a second perfume. She worried someone might notice, or worse, that no one would. Across the street, Mrs. Whitcomb was concluding her evening ritual, drawing the curtains of her bedroom precisely half an inch apart, just enough to watch the street below without being seen. Her maid, loyal but not blind, had already stepped out to breathe the night air after extinguishing the last candelabra. The girl paused at the doorway, nose twitching. Something sweet. Not the kind Mrs. Whitcomb wore. Not perfume. Not brandy. Something colder. She lingered for a moment, unsettled, before hurrying back inside. Servants always sensed danger before their employers did, though they rarely named it aloud. Farther down the street, two carriages passed one another in the lamplit dark, their wheels splashing through shallow puddles left by the evening rain. Inside one of them, Lady Montrose reclined against the velvet seat, fan pressed lightly to her cheek. Her maid, seated opposite, watched her mistress with growing concern. Lady Montrose's eyes were unfocused, drifting lazily from window to ceiling, as though the world outside were only fog. When the carriage jolted over a rut, she did not startle. She only smiled faintly. Her maid swallowed, hands clenching in her lap. The scent had grown stronger since they left Lady Hardwicke's home. She could smell it now. Sweet, medicinal, like the ether they used in the hospital ward when she nursed sickbeds before entering service. Memories of unconscious patients, pale faces, and breath that hovered between life and sleep rose unbidden in her mind. The maid dared not speak, but she knew. The entire street seemed to breathe the same unnatural sweetness that night, though only those with keen noses or anxious hearts detected it. It drifted into alleyways, slipped beneath door cracks, danced around lampposts with the gaslit fog. Already it was becoming part of London's nocturnal perfume. A scent hidden beneath respectability. An invisible thread connecting women who did not yet realize they were tethered to one another by something stronger than friendship, by habit, by secrecy, by the growing need that fluttered in their chests like a trapped moth. Eleanor leaned on the balcony, eyes half closed. Mrs. Whitcomb watched from her bedroom window, her breath fogging the glass. Lady Montrose rested her head against the carriage window, the world spinning softly. Across Mayfair, lamps flickered, curtains trembled. The night grew quiet, too quiet. For the first time, the sweet scent of ether, once confined to doctors' rooms and private vanities, had drifted into the open air of London itself. It rode the breeze like a warning no one chose to heed. Below, the cobblestones glistened with lamplight. Above, the stars blurred behind a thin, wavering haze. And the city exhaled, unaware that its most elegant women were beginning to dissolve into that sweetness, breath by breath, drop by drop, night by night. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about Lady Harbury's luncheon. A long white table beneath a canopy of wisteria, crystal pitchers filled with chilled lemonade, and an arrangement of pastries so delicate they looked as though they would dissolve at the slightest touch. A trio of musicians played softly under a pergola, their notes drifting like lace through the garden. It should have been a pleasant, lively affair, the kind of midday gathering where conversation fluttered brightly between the socially ambitious and the discreetly observant. But on this particular afternoon, something hung over the gathering like an invisible veil. Something quiet, something heavy, something sweet. Lady Harbury, normally a force of unrelenting chatter, prized for her ability to fill any silence with cheerful trivialities, found herself glancing repeatedly at her guests. They sat perfectly poised, parasols angled with practiced precision, yet they seemed strangely unanimated. Their eyes were glassy, their smiles delayed by a second too long, their responses drifting into the air as though they had travelled from a great distance. It took Lady Harbury nearly half an hour to realize what she was truly observing, not tranquility, but vacancy. Mrs. Ashmore was the first to draw her concern. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table, hands carefully folded in her lap, though her fork had remained untouched for almost the entire meal. Before her lay a plate of dainty cucumber sandwiches, their edges curling in the warm air. But Eleanor's gaze was fixed somewhere beyond them, somewhere far quieter than the cheerful garden they all occupied. Her lips parted only when someone spoke directly to her, and even then her responses felt soft, imprecise, weighed down by some private burden. Next was Lady Montrose. She had always been animated at gatherings, a woman who could transform even the dullest topic into a matter of delicious fascination. But today her movements were slow, almost dreamy. She dabbed absently at her lips with a linen napkin, staring into her teacup as though its pale amber depths held the meaning of her entire existence. "Are you quite well, my dear?" Lady Harbury ventured. Lady Montrose blinked, her expression smoothing into a faint smile. "Perfectly," she murmured, simply adjusting to the weather. Lady Harbury nodded, though the explanation rang hollow. It was a mild afternoon, hardly the kind that drained one's spirit, but she did not press further. Not yet. Meanwhile, two younger ladies at the other end of the table seemed engaged in a muted whisper. Their conversation lacked its usual bright sparkle. Instead, they leaned toward one another with a conspiratorial urgency, lips nearly touching, eyes darting about in brief, nervous intervals. It was then, at that soft, strange moment, that Lady Harbury caught a faint scent drifting along the table. Not from the roses, not from the pastries, not from the cooling lemonade. A sweetness sharper than sugar, familiar in a way she could not immediately place, though it stirred something uneasy in her memory. A sensation of hospitals, of cold iron tools, of white-knuckled hands gripping the arms of surgical chairs. Ether. Her breath hitched. She looked again at her guests. Mrs. Ashmore's distant stare, Lady Montrose's lethargic grace, the fluttering whispers of the younger women. Her heart tightened. The luncheon grew quieter still, the musicians playing on with gentle obliviousness. The sound of their strings felt strangely out of place, too lively, too hopeful for the heavy stillness settling over the table. Lady Harbury lifted her teacup, hands trembling just slightly. Behind her composed expression, her mind raced. She knew the scent had no place here among her prized flowers, knew it should not cling to gloves or echo from pale lips, knew that something was unraveling within this garden tableau of genteel perfection. And as conversations dwindled into thin pauses, Lady Harbury realized with a sudden chill, her luncheon, her respectable, meticulously planned social affair, had become a silent gathering of drifting minds, a congregation of women bound together not by society, but by a shared, unspoken dependency. The wisteria swayed lightly above them. The musicians played on, and beneath the soft, sweet air of the garden, the truth settled like a shadow. Even the most elegant luncheon in London could no longer disguise the hollowing effect of ether's quiet hold. The Ashmore townhouse on Belgrave Street was the sort of residence that seemed perpetually polished, brass gleaming, windows shining, carpets brushed, until not a single thread lay out of place. Mr. Jonathan Ashmore, a man of order and confidence, believed his home reflected the stability of his life. He wore his success like a tailored coat, crisp and immaculate, convinced he possessed a thorough understanding of every detail that mattered. And yet, the most important detail slipped past him every night. Eleanor sat before her vanity that evening, hairpins scattered like fallen petals across the lace runner. In the mirror, her reflection appeared oddly distant, softened by the dim glow of the gas lamp. She dabbed rouge along her cheekbones, though her hands trembled with a delicacy that could not be explained by cold or fatigue. Behind her, the door to the adjoining dressing room remained ajar. Jonathan had just returned home. She heard him, as always, the jingle of keys, the authoritative clearing of his throat, the steady rhythm of steps that announced his presence long before he entered the room. He paused in the doorway, adjusting his cufflinks, surveying her with a mixture of fondness and impatience. "My dear, you've been sitting there for an age," he remarked. "We are expected at the Elwoods by 7. Eleanor smiled weakly, lifting her chin with practiced poise. Just a moment more. Jonathan stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across her reflection. "You look pale," he said lightly. "Have you been eating properly?" The question carried no depth of concern, only the perfunctory cadence of a husband performing his role. Eleanor nodded, though in truth she had barely eaten at Lady Harbury's luncheon. Her appetite dwindled daily, vanishing into the same haze that clouded her thoughts. Jonathan reached for his pocket watch, flicking it open, then frowned. "It's not like you to dally. Are the servants delaying you? If so, I shall speak to them." "No," Eleanor whispered. "Please don't. I'm quite fine." If he had stepped closer, if he had stood where the lamplight kissed the air near her shoulder, he might have noticed the faint sweetness lingering on her skin. But Jonathan was already turning away, distracted by his own reflection in the mirror on the opposite wall. He smoothed his hair, adjusted his tie, and said, "I've had a trying day at the office. 3 meetings. I suppose your outing was pleasant?" Eleanor hesitated. She wanted to tell him everything: the powder room whispers, the trembling hands, the silence at the luncheon, the way ether draped itself over her nerves like a velvet shroud. She wanted him to notice the bottle tucked into her drawer, the tightness in her breath, the way her nights stretched into strange, shadowed hours. "Yes," she answered instead. "Pleasant." He nodded briskly, satisfied. "Good. These social obligations can be tedious, but at least they keep you occupied." Occupied. The word stung. Jonathan crossed the room, retrieving his gloves. "The carriage will be ready shortly. Do come down when you are prepared." He left with the same efficiency he brought to everything, the closing of the door soft yet final. Eleanor waited until his footsteps faded down the staircase. Then, with trembling fingers, she pulled open the top drawer of her vanity. There it was, the blue-labeled bottle. Her pulse fluttered. She uncorked it gently, inhaling the faintest thread of sweetness. It slid into her lungs like a sigh, like a promise. Her reflection blurred, softened, grew mercifully indistinct around the edges. Below, the servants prepared the evening coats. The horses stamped impatiently in the courtyard. Jonathan Ashmore discussed business prospects with the driver, as though he understood the world with absolute clarity. And upstairs, his wife, drifting quietly into the fog of her own making, slipped the bottle into her reticule with practiced ease. The husband did not notice. He never had. He never would. For in Victorian society, a woman's decline could unfold in plain view, hidden behind rouge, silk, and delicate smiles, and yet remain invisible to the man who believed her troubles were merely trifles of temperament. The ether's sweetness lingered in the room long after Eleanor descended the stairs. The gas lamp flickered, the vanity mirror clouded faintly, and the night, silent and perfumed, swallowed the truth whole. The Ashmore household ran with the quiet precision expected of a respectable Victorian home. Fires stoked before dawn, floors scrubbed until they shone, silver polished to a mirror's gleam. Servants moved like shadows, present, efficient, and unheard. But even shadows notice things. And lately, Clara, the youngest housemaid, had noticed far too much. She had been dusting the drawing-room mantel when it first happened. Morning light slanted through the tall windows in soft gold bands, catching the specks of dust dancing through the air. Everything was still, orderly. Yet the moment Mrs. Ashmore entered, something shifted. The faint clink of glass in her reticule, the brief flash of panic in her eyes when her hand brushed the bag too sharply, the tremor in her fingers, quickly hidden beneath lace gloves. But it was the scent that had unsettled Clara most. A sweetness that didn't belong to the flowers arranged on the table, a chill that didn't match the warmth of the fire. It lingered in the air as Eleanor passed, curling around the edges of the room like a soft, invisible fog. Clara had smelled it only once before 3 years ago, when her aunt lay on a surgical table at St. Bartholomew's, half conscious and fighting for breath, while a doctor pressed a cloth soaked with ether to her nose. She had never forgotten that smell. She certainly wouldn't forget it now. Over the next week, the scent appeared again and again, not strong, just faint enough to pass unnoticed by those who wished not to see. But servants did not have the luxury of deliberate blindness. Clara began to observe what others missed. The untouched tray of breakfast brought back to the kitchen, the peculiar languor in Mrs. Ashmore's footsteps, the way the mistress would startle at the slightest sound, then retreat behind a mask of gentility. Then came the morning of the open drawer. Clara had been sent upstairs to collect laundry. She knocked softly at the bedroom door, received no answer, and entered with caution, a rule drilled into every servant's training. Mrs. Ashmore was nowhere in sight. Her dressing gown lay carelessly draped over a chair, an unusual disarray for a woman known for her immaculate habits. Clara crossed the room, gathering linens with careful hands, when the gleam of glass caught her eye. The vanity drawer, usually kept shut, stood slightly ajar. Inside lay the bottle. Small, blue-labeled, radiating that chilling sweetness even without its cork removed. Clara froze, heartbeat quickening like a trapped bird. She knew better than to pry, but the bottle seemed to look back at her, an object both ordinary and ominous. An object out of place in a married woman's private things. Voices drifted from the corridor. Footsteps. Panicked, Clara reached to push the drawer closed and in her haste brushed the bottle. It rolled gently, clinking against a silver hairbrush before settling back into the shadows of the vanity. The scent rose, sharper now, unmistakable. She snapped the drawer shut, just as Mrs. Ashmore entered. Eleanor's eyes were distant, ringed faintly with fatigue. "Clara," she murmured, "what are you doing?" "Only collecting the laundry, ma'am." Her voice wavered despite her best efforts. Eleanor nodded, smoothing her hair with trembling fingers. "Of course. Carry on." But as Clara left the room, she caught the mistress's reflection in the mirror, the quick glance toward the drawer, the tightening of her jaw, the way her hand drifted instinctively toward her reticule. Clara descended the stairs slowly, her legs unsteady. She knew now with sickening clarity that something was wrong, terribly wrong. Yet she also knew her place. Servants were not meant to intervene in the affairs of their betters. They were not meant to question bottles or tremors or the fragile, brittle quiet that had settled over the household. Her duty was to remain silent. But silence was heavy, and it grew heavier each day. By evening, the sweet scent drifted through the hallway again, threading itself into the fabric of the curtains, the rugs, the very air she breathed. Clara paused at the foot of the stairs, gripping the banister as a thought unwelcome and frightening flickered in her mind. If the mistress continued on like this, would the house remain standing? Would the family? Would she? Outside, a carriage rolled past, its wheels hissing over the cobblestones. Inside, the Ashmore home glowed with lamplight and quiet doom. And Clara, a mere servant, carried a truth too heavy for her small shoulders. Night had once been Eleanor Ashmore's refuge, a cool, velvet-draped quietude in which the world softened and the relentless demands of daylight finally loosened their grip. But now the nights stretched long and restless, thick with shadows that trembled at the edges of her vision. Sleep, once an obedient companion, had deserted her completely. It began subtly, a few uneasy hours, a mind that refused to settle, a heartbeat that fluttered beneath her ribs like a frightened bird. But soon, even exhaustion failed her. Eleanor found herself lying awake until dawn, drifting in and out of shallow, uneasy half-dreams that left her more depleted than alert. On the third consecutive night without rest, she rose from bed with the quiet, fragile resolve of someone at war with her own body. Jonathan slept heavily beside her, oblivious, breathing with steady, untroubled rhythm. The glow of the gas lamp filtered faintly through the heavy drapes, casting a muted golden haze across the room. Eleanor moved silently to the vanity. Her fingers closed around the familiar bottle even before she lit the lamp. The label's soft blue gleam seemed almost luminous in the darkness, as though calling to her. She uncorked it with trembling hands, and the sweetness lifted gently into the air. A sigh escaped her lips. Just a little, she told herself. Enough to quiet the rush of thoughts swirling like loose pages of a book caught in wind. Enough to calm the trembling in her hands. Enough to let her drift not fully into sleep, but into something like it, something cool and merciful. She leaned forward, inhaling the delicate vapor. Relief washed over her like warm silk. The room softened, the edges of the walls blurred faintly. Her breathing slowed. For a moment, she believed sleep might finally take pity on her. But sleep did not come. Instead, the night grew longer. The hours passed in a strange suspension, not restful, not wakeful, but something in between. a drifting consciousness, a quiet vacancy. Her body felt lighter, but her mind buzzed with a peculiar clarity, darting from thought to thought without coherence, like lanterns floating in distant fog. By dawn, Eleanor sat with her head resting against the vanity mirror, the bottle still beside her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her pulse unsteady. Downstairs, the servant stirred. Clara, already alert with worry, paused when she heard the soft, uneven footsteps overhead, a pacing rhythm she had heard more frequently of late. She exchanged a troubled glance with the cook, who whispered something about nervous dispositions and ladies' ailments. But Clara knew better. Those footsteps did not belong to a woman merely troubled by nerves. The household soon felt the effects of Eleanor's sleeplessness. Trays of food returned untouched to the kitchen. Dresses were left half-buttoned or forgotten entirely. A vase shattered one morning when she misjudged its distance from her hand. She forgot appointments, repeated questions, stared into the middle distance as though searching for something others could not see. Jonathan noticed none of it. Or rather, he noticed, but explained it away. She tires herself with social affairs, he told a colleague over breakfast. These luncheons exhaust delicate women. But it was not the luncheons. It was the nights. In the evenings, Eleanor grew quieter, her eyes deepening into hollow shadows. She no longer joined Jonathan in reading or conversation. Instead, she slipped away early, claiming headaches, though her footsteps could be heard pacing behind her closed bedroom door long after midnight. That door, once merely a boundary between day and rest, now concealed a growing darkness, the slow unraveling of a woman suspended in a state of perpetual wakefulness. The house itself seemed to feel it. The halls grew heavy. Lamps flickered strangely, reflecting Eleanor's haunted movements as she wandered from window to window, unable to calm the restless storm within her chest. Outside, London slept under a blanket of fog. Inside, one woman drifted through a night that never ended. And the sweetness of ether, that cool, deceptive balm, rose in faint curls through the still air, promising rest while stealing it entirely. The Ashmore home remained impeccable, polished, and proper. But within its walls, sleep had abandoned its mistress, and something else, something quieter, more dangerous had taken its place. The change was subtle at first, the kind of difference one notices only in passing, and then dismisses politely, the way Victorians were trained to ignore anything uncomfortable. But soon it became impossible to deny that something had dimmed in Eleanor Ashmore's gaze, a soft radiance extinguished by some unseen hand. Her eyes had once been lively, bright with curiosity and gentleness. They reflected candlelight like warm amber, especially during evenings spent reading beside the fire. Now, though still beautiful in their way, they had become clouded, their light buried beneath layers of exhaustion, vapors, and unspoken dread. The transformation made itself known at the Chiltern Charity Luncheon, an event Eleanor typically adored. It was held in a magnificent conservatory filled with orchids, ferns, and gentle sunlight filtered through glass panes. Ladies in pale muslin dresses strolled among the greenery, their conversations weaving soft music through the warm air. But amid all the colour and chatter, Eleanor floated like a pale ghost. Mrs. Pennington, a perceptive woman known for her ruthless accuracy in assessing others, observed her from across the room. The longer she looked, the more her brows knit in concern. Eleanor's eyes, once bright as morning light, now carried a vacant sheen, a glaze that suggested she was looking at everyone and no one simultaneously. When she moved, it was with the fragile precision of someone carefully hiding a tremor. Mrs. Pennington approached her gently. "My dear Eleanor, you seem fatigued." Eleanor blinked slowly, lashes fluttering like weakened wings. "I am quite well," she answered, though her voice carried a thinness that betrayed her. "Simply a touch overtired." "A touch?" Her eyes told another story entirely. They were hollow at the center, ringed with faint bruising that no amount of powder could fully conceal. When she smiled and she tried, valiantly, the expression did not reach them. They remained distant, unfocused, as though perpetually peering through a thin veil. Lady Montrose, standing nearby, exchanged a tremulous glance with Mrs. Pennington. She knew that look too well. She had seen it in her own mirror on especially difficult mornings, the strange dullness, the faint tremor under the surface of her gaze, the reflection that no longer felt entirely connected. Later, while Eleanor paused near a cluster of orchids, Lady Montrose stepped closer, her voice low. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes, glassy and exhausted, filled briefly with something like fear before the expression shuttered away. She simply shook her head. Lady Montrose reached out, touching her gloved hand. "You must be cautious, my dear. This drifting, it begins with sleepless nights, but then—" Eleanor pulled her hand back too quickly. "I can manage," she whispered. "I just need a little help, now and then." Lady Montrose's expression softened with reluctant sympathy. She too had once believed she could manage. She too had once thought she controlled the bottle rather than the reverse. From the far end of the conservatory, Clara, accompanying her mistress as a maid for the first time, watched with a clenched heart. She saw everything the others saw, but with sharper clarity. While society women wrapped their observations in polite concern, Clara recognized the truth without ornamentation. Mrs. Ashmore's eyes had lost their sparkle because something inside her was burning away. She barely touched the finger sandwiches offered to her. She excused herself twice to the powder room, and each time she returned, the sweetness on her breath grew stronger. Even the orchids, fragrant as they were, could not mask it. By the event's end, Eleanor moved like someone adrift, as though the world were a step ahead of her and she was forever trying to catch it. When Jonathan arrived to escort her home, he failed to notice anything amiss. He kissed her cheek, oblivious to the faint tremor in her eyelids and the way her gaze unfocused behind him. But others noticed and whispered, "Poor thing, she seems unwell. Too delicate, that one. So pale, perhaps her nerves." No one spoke the truth, but everyone felt its chill. As the carriage wheels rolled away from the conservatory, Eleanor pressed her forehead to the window pane. Her reflection stared back at her dim-eyed, hollow, flickering. Eyes that had once glowed like warm amber now looked like fogged glass. And behind them, something fragile was slowly, silently breaking. The Harrington soirée was expected to be the highlight of the early summer season, an evening of champagne, waltzes, flirtations disguised as polite conversation, and a small orchestra hired from Vienna expressly for the occasion. The house on Brook Street shimmered with candlelight, its windows aglow like a row of lanterns, beckoning London's finest inside. The air was meant to be alive with brightness. But from the moment the guests began arriving, something felt askew. It was subtle at first, a peculiar hush beneath the lively music, a certain languor in the movements of several ladies as they drifted through the crowd with the grace of sleepwalkers rather than the animated charm expected at such events. The orchestra played impeccably, yet even their crisp, elegant notes seemed to fall into a room that was only half listening. Eleanor Ashmore stepped into the ballroom on Jonathan's arm, her gown a shimmering pale blue that should have made her appear radiant. Instead, she seemed almost translucent, as though some essential part of her had faded into the very fabric of the dress. Her eyes flickered briefly with awareness when greeted, but the light dimmed almost immediately afterward, replaced by a soft, drifting detachment. "Eleanor, my dear, you look lovely," remarked Mrs. Pennington with rehearsed warmth. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You are too kind." But the words were barely above a whisper, floating into the air like a sigh rather than a greeting. Nearby, Lady Montrose stood beside the refreshments table, lifting a glass of champagne that she made no effort to drink. Her gaze wandered from face to face with a dreamy, unfocused quality. When the violins began a lively waltz, she flinched ever so slightly as though the sudden burst of sound startled her. Mrs. Whitcomb arrived soon after, moving as though she floated rather than walked. Her gloved fingers toyed with the fringe of her shawl, her lips parted as though trying to recall something she had forgotten. Her eyes searched the room, not for familiar faces, but for a quiet corner where she might rest her trembling hands. It was an off-kilter ballroom, a gathering where half the guests were present in body but elsewhere in spirit. The hostess, Mrs. Harrington, sensed it instantly. She prided herself on orchestrating her events with the precision of a conductor. Conversation flowing here, laughter bubbling there, dancers swirling with grace at precisely the right moment. But tonight, no amount of careful planning could disguise the strange dissonance. She leaned toward her husband. "Do you notice it?" she murmured. "Notice what?" he replied, already distracted by a group of business associates. "The women," she whispered. "Something is wrong with them." She watched as Eleanor swayed slightly where she stood, not from the heat or the music, but from an internal unsteadiness she was trying and failing to conceal. Lady Montrose's hand shook as she set down her untouched champagne. Mrs. Whitcomb blinked slowly, as though fighting to stay present. Even the way they spoke seemed altered. Their voices carried a faint delay, as though the words reached their lips only after drifting through some fog-laden corridor of the mind. Mrs. Harrington caught a passing maid by the arm. "Bring more iced water," she murmured urgently. "Some of the ladies seem faint." "Yes, ma'am," the maid replied. But the maid, like Clara at the Ashmore home, knew the truth. She could smell it, faint yet unmistakable, drifting among the women like a hidden perfume, sweet, cool, chemical, a scent she had last encountered only in hospital wards. Ether. She hurried toward the kitchen, unsettled. As the evening progressed, the ballroom's energy never quite gathered itself. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. A young lady forgot the steps to a waltz she had danced flawlessly for years. Another dropped her fan 3 times, staring at it with bewildered hesitation before picking it up. The laughter, when it came, was thin, brittle, like glass about to crack. By the end of the night, the subtle discord had grown palpable. The orchestra continued playing, but its music felt mismatched to the room, like a hymn performed in a fog-covered graveyard. When Jonathan escorted Eleanor back to the carriage, he remarked lightly, "Strange crowd tonight. Everyone looked half asleep." Eleanor's response was soft, drifting. Yes, half asleep. But in truth, they were not asleep. They were dissolving, slipping into a quiet, tremulous haze that no one spoke of, yet no one could deny. A gentle unthreading masked beneath silk gowns and polished manners. Inside the Harrington ballroom, the final notes of the waltz faded into silence. And silence, sweet and eerie, settled over the room like a veil. The party had not ended. It had drifted off key. And London, if it continued to look the other way, would soon do the same. Lady Emmeline Hartwell had always been known for her punctuality. In a society governed by clocks and calling cards, she was a model of refinement, never late to a luncheon, never absent from a dinner, never dishevelled or indisposed. Her household ran like a well-oiled carriage, smooth, precise, elegant. Perhaps that was why the sudden changes startled everyone so deeply. It began innocently enough. Emmeline excused herself early from an evening gathering, claiming a faint headache. Her husband, Lord Hartwell, barely raised an eyebrow. Headaches were practically an accessory among fashionable ladies. But the next morning, her maid found the bedroom door locked, something unheard of in their household. "Lady Hartwell," the maid called gently, tapping on the polished wood. A long silence. Then Emmeline's voice, soft and strained. "I am not to be disturbed." When she finally emerged hours later, she was pale but composed, her gown immaculate, her hair pinned with perfect precision. Only her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, a faint glaze, like frost obscuring a once clear mirror. By the third morning, the door remained locked again. This time, the maid pressed her ear against it. She heard shuffling, an object falling, then the unmistakable clink of glass. A pause. Then Emmeline's uneven breath, a choking gasp that stilled the maid's heart. Inside the room, Emmeline stood before her vanity, gripping its edge with both hands. The bottle sat open beside her, its sweet vapor still drifting through the air like an illicit prayer. Her heartbeat fluttered wildly, her vision blurring and sharpening unpredictably. The walls seemed to breathe with her, expanding, contracting as though urging her to take just one more inhalation. She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. "Not yet," she whispered. "I need clarity, control." But clarity had become a stranger to her. Her hands had begun shaking at night. Her thoughts tangled upon themselves. Sleep slipped away like silk from restless fingers. The bottle, once a source of gentle calm, now demanded her devotion, a soft-spoken tyrant ruling from the shadows of her dressing table. On the fourth night, Lord Hartwell noticed something was truly wrong. After returning from his club, he found Emmeline already retired. Not unusual, but her bedroom door was locked again, and the light beneath it glowed long past midnight. He knocked, soft at first, then louder. "My dear, are you unwell?" A chair scraped across the floor, then silence. Finally, she replied, her voice too calm, as though wrapped in cotton. "I am fine. Please, leave me." He frowned, troubled. His wife had always been open with him, or at least as open as Victorian propriety allowed. But this calm dismissal, this eerie isolation, was entirely new. Downstairs, 2 footmen whispered in the pantry. "Lady Hartwell hasn't eaten in days. Have you seen her eyes? Hollow, like she hasn't slept? And the smell," the younger footman's voice dropped, "like the infirmary, like that stuff they give to patients before surgery. Ether." They did not say it aloud. Servants knew that names carried weight, and this name, this scent, was becoming too familiar, too dangerous. By the end of the week, Emmeline rarely left her bedroom at all. Meals delivered to her door returned untouched. Curtains remained drawn, turning the chamber into a twilight realm where time had no authority. Lamps burned low through the night, their flame reflecting off the glass bottle she kept close, as though it were a talisman protecting her from some unseen terror. One evening, Lord Hartwell finally forced the issue. He ordered the maid to bring him the spare key, a key he had never intended to use. As he turned it in the lock, a cold dread washed over him. The door creaked open. The room was stifling, fragrant with powder and the unmistakable sweetness of ether. Emmeline sat in her armchair, back straight, hands folded in her lap, her expression serene, too serene. Her eyes lifted to meet his, but they held no spark, no recognition for a long, terrible moment. "My dear," he whispered, "what have you done to yourself?" Emmeline blinked slowly. Her voice floated through the dim air, distant and echoing. "I only wished to rest." He stepped inside, horrified by the array of half-empty bottles, now lining her vanity like soldiers of surrender. The room smelled like a soft, chemical fog, as though the ether itself had become a silent occupant. Behind her, the curtains shivered with the faintest breeze. But Emmeline did not move. In the dim, golden lamplight, she looked less like the woman he married, and more like a pale apparition sitting quietly at the edge of her own life. And from that moment on, the household whispered of the lady of the locked bedroom, a woman held captive not by bars or illness, but by a sweet vapour that promised peace while stealing everything else. Mr. Alfred Pritchard's chemist shop on Grosvenor Lane had always been a place of mild curiosity and comfort, a modest establishment where ladies purchased lavender sachets, gentlemen inquired about tonics for indigestion, and harried mothers sought relief for teething infants. Shelves lined with blue and amber bottles glowed softly in the lamplight, creating an atmosphere of quiet reassurance. The scent of camphor, rosewater, and beeswax seemed to lull even the busiest patron into a sense of trust. And trust was something Mr. Pritchard never lacked. He was a quiet man, soft-spoken, always impeccably courteous. His spectacles perched delicately on his nose, and his hands long-fingered and steady-handled glassware with the grace of a musician. People felt safe in his shop. That was his greatest talent. It was also what made him dangerous. For while other chemists asked questions, "Are you feeling pain? Has your doctor approved this? Do you understand the dosage?" Mr. Pritchard merely nodded, smiled, and filled the request. The first time Eleanor Ashmore stepped into his shop, the bell above the door chimed with a delicate tinkle. She looked fragile, exhausted, her gloved hands clutching her reticule in a gesture that screamed of quiet desperation. Mr. Pritchard greeted her with a polite bow. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Ashmore. A pleasure to see you again." Her voice trembled. "I require another bottle of the ether vapor preparation." He did not ask why. He did not ask how she had used the last one so quickly. He did not ask how often she inhaled it, or whether her doctor had instructed her to do so. He merely reached for a bottle, the familiar blue label shimmering faintly, and wrapped it neatly in paper. "That will be 2 shillings, madam." Eleanor's relief was almost palpable. She handed over the coins with shaking fingers, her eyes flicking anxiously toward the windows, as though fearful someone might see her there. Mr. Pritchard merely smiled. If he noticed the tremors in her hands, he said nothing. If he observed the hollowness in her eyes that once sparkled like warm amber, he did not comment. If he recognized the faint sweetness clinging to her breath, he made no remark. Why should he? Business was business. And the demand for restoratives among London's high society had been rising steadily for months now. Ladies arrived at his counter with quiet urgency, always glancing over their shoulders, always speaking in hushed tones. Lady Montrose visited twice in 1 week. Mrs. Whitcomb sent her maid, unwilling to be seen. Even Lady Harbury, usually so composed, had appeared flustered one morning, asking for something to soothe a restless mind. And for each of them, Mr. Pritchard obliged. He kept no ledger of unusual frequency, no notes of concern. His only record was the growing number of empty spaces on the shelf where the blue-labeled bottles once sat. He refilled them without hesitation. One dreary afternoon, young Clara, out on an errand for the cook, passed by the chemist and caught sight of Mrs. Ashmore leaving the shop. Her mistress moved with hurried steps, her veil pulled low over her face. Clara's heart tightened. She knew where Eleanor had been. She knew why. Inside, Mr. Pritchard was already preparing another bottle, humming a gentle tune as he wrapped it in crisp brown paper. To him, the rhythm of the work was soothing. To London, it was quietly catastrophic. For as more ladies arrived, pale, restless, trembling, the chemist's shop became an unsupervised dispensary for dependents, a place where symptoms were ignored, where desperation slipped by unnoticed, where the sweet scent of ether drifted every time the door opened, like a warning that no one heeded. And still, he asked no questions. Because in a city of polished facades and whispered troubles, the simplest way to keep one's shop thriving was to mind one's own business. Even when that business fueled an epidemic, even when those polite blue bottles were quietly hollowing out the women who purchased them. Mr. Pritchard dusted his shelves, straightened a row of tonics, and took no note of the fact that he had become the trusted guardian of a very dangerous secret. And as the bell above the door chimed once more, announcing yet another anxious lady stepping inside, he merely adjusted his spectacles and smiled, prepared to offer the same unwavering courtesy. The chemist who asked no questions, and the city that preferred it that way. Miss Margaret Linton had served the Ashmore household for nearly 2 years, long enough to know the patterns of its daily life, the the moods of the children, and the unspoken tensions that flowed like quiet rivers beneath the surface of any respectable Victorian home. A governess lived between worlds, too educated to belong downstairs, too humble to truly belong upstairs. This limbo granted her a vantage point few others enjoyed. She saw everything, and lately everything was troubling. From the nursery window, Margaret often watched Mrs. Ashmore wander into the garden in the early mornings, shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, the hem of her nightdress brushing the dewy grass. Eleanor moved slowly, as though testing her own balance with each step. Sometimes she simply stood still beneath the lilac tree, staring at nothing with a vacant softness that made Margaret's heart tighten. The children had begun to notice, too. "Why does Mama sleep in the day?" young Henry asked one afternoon, his brow furrowed in the earnest confusion only a child could express. "She's tired, darling," Margaret murmured, smoothing his hair. "But she sleeps funny," little Clara added, clutching her doll. "Like she's awake even when her eyes are closed." Margaret paused. Children were often painfully accurate observers of truth. Later that evening, as she escorted them downstairs to the parlor for their father's good-night kiss, Margaret caught sight of Eleanor descending the staircase. Her posture was perfect, years of etiquette ensuring she never slouched, but something about her movement felt delayed, as though her body and mind were drifting slightly out of sync. Her eyes held that faint, glassy sheen again. Margaret felt a cold unease unfurl in her chest. During her position in a previous household, she had cared for a young mistress recovering from a surgical procedure. The doctors had used ether generously, and the lingering scent had clung to the girl for days. It was a smell Margaret had hoped never to encounter again, but she had smelled it now, faintly, unmistakably clinging to Eleanor's gloves, and on the lace collar of her dress. And, once, drifting from the crack beneath her bedroom door, governesses were trained not to interfere in matters beyond their station, yet the more Margaret observed, the less she could ignore. Eleanor's hands trembled when she poured tea. She dropped her embroidery needle twice in one sitting. She answered questions with a delay, blinking as though she had heard the words from underwater. The worst moment came one cloudy afternoon, when Margaret left the schoolroom to fetch a book from the library. Passing the second-floor landing, she heard the soft sound of a bottle tipping over, then a muted gasp. She turned. The door to Mrs. Ashmore's private sitting room was ajar. Margaret hesitated propriety, urging her to move on, instinct demanding she stay. Then she heard Eleanor's voice, quiet, fractured. "Just for a moment. Please, let me steady myself." Margaret stepped closer, heart pounding. Through the narrow gap, she saw Eleanor at her writing desk, her back bent, her hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. The familiar blue bottle lay on its side, its cork rolling slowly, mockingly, across the polished floor. Eleanor reached for it with shaking hands, her breath shallow. Margaret's mouth went dry. She wanted to speak, to call her name, to rush in, but her feet remained frozen. She knew too well the rules of the invisible wall separating her from the family she served. She slipped away before Eleanor could sense she had been observed. That night, Margaret lay awake in her small attic room, listening to the creaks of the old house settling into darkness. She thought of the children, their innocent questions. She thought of the sweet, cold scent that did not belong in a home filled with young laughter. And she thought of Eleanor, pale and trembling, gripping the bottle as though it were her only anchor in an ocean of swirling uncertainty. In the attic's dimness, Margaret whispered a single, helpless truth. "I cannot unsee this." Outside, the wind brushed against the eaves. Inside, somewhere below her, a cork popped softly, and the governess, trapped by duty, compassion, and silence, realized she was the only one in the household who knew just how far Eleanor Ashmore had begun to fall. The Whitcomb Winter Ball had always been an event of abundance, an annual spectacle of glittering gowns, overflowing tables, and genteel indulgence. The Whitcombes prided themselves on excess presented with exquisite refinement. Pyramids of sugared pastries, silver trays of carved pheasant, crystal bowls heaped with ripe berries despite the season. It was the kind of banquet that made society whisper approvingly, "They have taste and means." But this year, the abundance remained untouched. The ballroom glowed beneath cascades of candlelight, the air shimmering with the golden haze of chandeliers. A string quartet played from the far balcony, their notes graceful and precise. Footmen stood at perfect attention beside the buffet table. Yet, as the evening progressed, an eerie pattern emerged. Not a single woman ate. Lady Montrose drifted past the table first. Her gown, adorned with pearls, rustled delicately as she moved. She paused before a plate of frosted petites fours, normally her favorite, but her eyes glazed over them with something resembling dread. Her hand twitched toward her reticule, then fell back to her side. Mrs. Ashmore stood nearby with Jonathan, who accepted a plate of pheasant from a passing footman. Eleanor made no attempt to take anything for herself. Her gaze lingered on a bowl of winter fruits with a strange, hollow detachment, as though the colors were too bright, too vivid, too real against the soft haze behind her eyes. When Jonathan urged her softly, "Do eat something," she smiled and murmured, "In a moment," but the moment never came. Around the room, this peculiar restraint repeated itself like a haunting refrain. Lady Harbury lifted a fork, stared at the slice of cake upon it, then gently set it down without a bite. Miss Clairford carried a plate for nearly 10 minutes, untouched, before abandoning it on a nearby console. Mrs. Whitcomb herself, the hostess, nibbled the corner of a pastry, only to set it aside, swallowing hard as though fighting back nausea or trembling. The men noticed vaguely. But their confusion dissolved in brandy and conversation. They chalked it up to ladies' delicate appetites, never questioning why every woman seemed to possess one simultaneously. The servants, however, noticed everything. In the shadows behind the refreshment table, 2 maids whispered anxiously. "Not one of them's touched a single thing," whispered the younger maid, eyes wide. The older maid nodded gravely. Their faces looked drawn, pale, and the smell— she hesitated, her voice dropping to a frightened whisper. That same sweet smell as Mrs. Whitcomb's room, after her fainting spell. Ether. The word hung unspoken between them, sharp and cold as an icicle. Back in the ballroom, Mrs. Pennington, always perceptive, always appraising, studied the scene with increasing alarm. Ladies gliding through the room with 2 light steps, hollowed cheeks partially concealed by powder, trembling hands hidden behind fans, and beneath it all, that faint, unnerving sweetness that did not belong among candle wax and perfume. She approached Eleanor cautiously. "My dear, you must allow me to bring you a plate. You hardly touched anything at the luncheon earlier." Eleanor blinked slowly. "I'm quite satisfied." "But you haven't." "I am satisfied," she repeated with a strange firmness, her fingers tightening around her reticule. Her eyes darted toward the retiring room. Mrs. Pennington felt a chill creep up her spine. She watched as Lady Montrose drifted in the same direction as though called by some invisible thread, and then Mrs. Whitcomb excused herself shortly after. One by one, several ladies slipped away from the ballroom, moving toward the corridor where the powder room awaited. It looked harmless enough to the unobservant eye, but to Mrs. Pennington it was the most telling detail of all. The buffet table, once a symbol of lavish hospitality, stood under the chandeliers like a quiet accusation. The food grew colder by the minute, untouched, unacknowledged. Orchards of fruit wilted. Pastries lost their shine. Even the pheasant cooled into indifference. The music swelled. The candles flickered. The ladies vanished, one by one, into the corridor. And Mrs. Pennington, watching the empty plates and trembling fingertips, understood what London society refused to name: This was no longer simply a social season marked by exhaustion or nerves. It was an epidemic, one wrapped in silk, perfumed with roses, and carried by women who floated through their own lives like shadows. A ball where nobody ate. A ballroom full of ghosts still pretending to be living. The first snowfall of the season dusted London in a soft hush, muting the clatter of carriage wheels and turning the gaslit streets into a pale, dreamlike landscape. In Mayfair, the Ashmore residence glowed warmly through frosted windows, a beacon against the winter chill. Inside, Eleanor sat before her vanity, studying her reflection with an intensity that bordered on desperation. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her skin, once luminous, now carried a faint greyish pallor beneath the powder. Her cheekbones stood sharper, her face thinner. Her eyes, those warm amber eyes Jonathan had once complimented endlessly, looked dulled, rimmed with fatigue and shadow. They had lost their sparkle. Worse, they seemed to belong to someone else entirely. She leaned closer, breath fogging the glass. Was this truly her? A soft knock disrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Eleanor," came the gentle voice of Mrs. Harbury, her closest friend since girlhood. Eleanor straightened, dabbing powder to her cheeks with trembling fingers. "Do come in." Mrs. Harbury entered with her usual warm bustle, snowflakes melting on her cloak. She removed her gloves, her eyes instantly flickering toward Eleanor's face. "Oh, darling," she whispered, stepping nearer. "You look tired, more tired than I've ever seen you." Eleanor forced a smile. "It's the cold weather." Mrs. Harbury didn't believe that for a moment. She studied Eleanor's face, her expression a tightening knot of concern and confusion. "You're not yourself." Eleanor's throat constricted. She had grown adept at deflecting pity and suspicion alike, but from Mrs. Harbury, whose friendship was woven from years of confidences and laughter, the words pierced deeper than she expected. "I assure you, I'm fine," she murmured. Mrs. Harbury reached out, gently taking Eleanor's hands. They were trembling. "No, you aren't. Look at me, Ellie." Eleanor did. For a moment, the fog of denial thinned. Mrs. Harbury's eyes softened. "Do you remember when we used to go walking in Kensington Gardens? How you'd laugh at the swans? How full of life you were?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "You haven't laughed in weeks." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to deny, but the truth lodged in her chest. She turned her face away, staring once more at the reflection in the mirror. Her own eyes stared back, empty and unfamiliar. Mrs. Harbury moved around the vanity, stopping behind her. She rested her hands on Eleanor's shoulders, looking into the mirror as well. "This isn't you," she whispered. "This faded creature, this hollow-eyed woman." A tremor ran through Eleanor. She closed her eyes. "It's just exhaustion," she whispered. "Exhaustion does not smell sweet," Mrs. Harbury replied softly. Eleanor froze. Her friend had noticed. Mrs. Harbury continued, her voice barely above a breath. "Clara told me she worried about you. She said the scent from your room reminded her of the hospital where her aunt died." Eleanor's breath hitched. "I know that smell," Mrs. Harbury continued. "Ether. The first time I inhaled it before surgery, She stopped herself, shaking her head as if banishing the memory. "Eleanor, tell me the truth." But Eleanor could not speak. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Her eyes darted to the drawer where the bottle lay hidden. Mrs. Harbury followed her gaze and her expression collapsed. "Oh, Ellie," she whispered. Eleanor covered her face with her hands, shoulders trembling. "I only needed a little at first," she confessed in a broken voice. "To sleep, to be calm, to be—" "Enough." Mrs. Harbury knelt beside her, lifting Eleanor's chin with gentle hands. "You are enough. You always were." Eleanor's tears spilled silently, leaving trails down her powdered cheeks. "But I can't stop," she whispered. "I don't know how." Mrs. Harbury wrapped her in an embrace firm, warm, familiar. Eleanor sagged into it, the first moment of true comfort she had felt in weeks. But when Mrs. Harbury rose, her gaze flicked once more to the vanity drawer. She saw the outline of the bottle beneath its folds. Her heart clenched with dread. This was no simple fatigue, no passing ailment. It was a hollowing, a consuming, a slow, quiet theft of everything Eleanor used to be. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering London in white silence. Inside, two friends clung to each other, one trying to remember herself, the other terrified she might already be lost. And in the vanity drawer, the blue-labeled bottle waited, cold, patient, certain of its power. A friend might offer comfort, but ether offered escape, and for Eleanor, that distinction had grown devastatingly thin. London had always carried a certain drowsy romance in its winter months, fog rolling in from the river, lamps glowing through the mist like floating halos, footsteps softened against damp cobblestones. But this winter felt different. The fog seemed heavier, the silence longer, and the people, especially the women of Mayfair, moved through the city with a strange, drifting quality, as though caught between wakefulness and some half-remembered dream. It began with small observations, a maid noticing her mistress staring too long at nothing, a footman watching a lady descend a staircase with a momentary hesitation, as though her feet no longer trusted the ground, a shopkeeper pausing mid-sentence because the customer before him nodded with such slow, distant politeness that he wondered if she had heard him at all. Londoners chalked it up to the season, a touch of melancholy, winter nerves, the oppressive fog. Victorians had a phrase for everything except the truth, but the city felt it, and soon the city saw it. One cold morning, the streets around Bond Street filled with carriages as usual, horses stamping clouds of steam into the icy air. Elegantly dressed women stepped down with practiced grace, yet with something else lurking beneath their composure. Their eyes were unfocused, their smiles delayed, their movements too soft, too slow, as though choreographed in a dreamscape only they could see. Mrs. Harbury, who had come to purchase ribbons for her daughter's wedding trousseau, paused at the edge of the pavement. She watched as two ladies approached from opposite ends of the street. Neither seemed aware of the other's presence. Their parasols nearly collided before both women blinked in near startled unison. "My apologies," murmured the first, but her voice had the faint, airy tremor of someone speaking from a faraway room. "No matter," the second replied, though she appeared confused by the interaction, as if unsure what she had apologized for. Lady Montrose stumbled slightly as she stepped from her carriage, gripping the frame for balance. Her coachman reached out to help, but she waved him off with a trembling hand. She moved like someone trying to remember how her limbs worked. Across the street, Mrs. Whitcomb wandered toward the dressmaker's window display, staring at a mannequin draped in winter velvet, but her reflection pale, glassy-eyed, shimmering with a faint sheen of perspiration, was what caught the attention of passers-by. She merely blinked at it, expression unreadable. In the reflection, her eyes seemed almost empty. Inside Hatchard's bookshop, a young clerk watched as a woman drifted between shelves without touching a single book. She moved with eerie slowness, pausing now and then as though listening to some invisible whisper. When he offered assistance, she turned her head with barely perceptible delay. "I'm just looking," she murmured. Her pupils were dilated. Her breath carried a faint sweetness he could not place. By midday, the streets resembled a fog-covered stage where the actors performed half a beat behind the music. The city hummed with its usual routines, vendors calling out, carriages rattling by, chimney smoke curling skyward, but woven through it all was a growing eeriness. A collection of women drifting through London as though their minds were wrapped in cotton. A city of half-dreaming walkers. The servants noticed first, as servants often did. Clara, on her way to fetch lace trims for the children's clothing, stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Eleanor Ashmore standing outside a shop, staring into the distance as though trying to recall where she was. "Mrs. Ashmore?" Clara whispered, stepping closer. Eleanor didn't respond. Clara's heart hammered. She reached out, but before she touched her, Eleanor blinked rapidly, shook her head as if waking from a deep slumber, and moved on without a word. Clara followed her with her eyes until she disappeared into the crowd. Her mistress had walked away, but Clara felt colder than the winter air. She wasn't the only one haunted. At dinner parties, women forgot their lines in conversations. At church, they drifted through hymns with unfocused reverence. At the theatre, their eyes remained fixed on the stage, but their minds somewhere else entirely. London whispered, "Too much excitement, too little sleep, too many social obligations." But Clara knew. Mrs. Harbury suspected. Mrs. Pennington understood. It was the ether. Its sweetness hung over the city like a veil, delicate, deceptive, deadly. And as the fog thickened that winter, London found itself walking beside women who were present only in body, their minds quietly dissolving into vapor. A city of half-dreaming walkers. A city not yet ready to wake up. The idea began innocently, at least. That's what the ladies told themselves. It started with whispered confessions in powder rooms and exchanged glances during soirees, each woman recognizing the same quiet tremor, the same drifting haze, the same sweet scent clinging to gloves and lace. Soon, their shared affliction became a shared refuge. And from that refuge, a clandestine gathering took shape. They called it nothing. They named it nothing. They simply understood that once a week, behind the façade of polite society, they would meet in Lady Montrose's conservatory for what the invitations euphemistically described as a private restorative luncheon. In truth, there was no luncheon. Lady Montrose's conservatory was a warm, glass-panelled haven filled with tropical plants her husband imported from far-off colonies, a place where ferns unfurled like feathered fans and orchids glowed pale against the winter gloom. To any outsider, it seemed the perfect location for tea and conversation. But for the women who stepped inside, something else hung in the air. Ether, sweet, clean, almost holy. The first gathering took place on a Tuesday afternoon. Lady Montrose, pale but determined, greeted Eleanor Ashmore, Mrs. Whitcomb, and Miss Clairford with a smile far too serene to be entirely natural. Her hands trembled only slightly as she closed the conservatory doors behind them. The heavy latch clicked into place with a finality that sent a soft thrill through the room. "It's only us," Lady Montrose whispered. "You may relax." And they did. Gloves were removed with trembling fingers. Reticules were set down. Small blue bottles appeared atop the round wicker table beside the orchids, glistening like jewels hidden from the rest of the world. Miss Clairford was the first to inhale one quick breath, eyes fluttering shut as her shoulders sagged in near instant relief. Eleanor followed, lifting the bottle delicately, her breath catching faintly as the vapor wrapped itself around her mind like cool silk. Within minutes, conversation softened into dreamy murmurs. "Oh, how peaceful it feels here," Mrs. Whitcomb sighed, sinking into a cushioned chair. "Far better than the dreadful noise at the Harrington ball," Miss Clairford added, blinking slowly, as though the memory required physical effort. Lady Montrose smiled with wistful pride. "This is a place for us," she said softly, "a place where our nerves may settle without judgment." Eleanor stared at the swirling leaves above her, their green hues deepening and softening with each breath she took. The world felt warm and distant. The air shimmered faintly. For the first time in days, she felt herself drifting without the weight of fear or guilt. And that was the danger. Because soon these weekly gatherings became bi-weekly, then thrice-weekly. They no longer needed excuses. Their households assumed they were visiting each other for tea or charity meetings. What harm could there be in a gathering of respectable women? Inside the conservatory, the truth unfolded quietly. They spoke of sleepless nights, of fainting at parties, of hands that no longer obeyed, of hearts that beat too quickly or too slow. They confessed these secrets in soft voices, comforted by the knowledge that everyone present shared the same affliction. "It is our burden," Mrs. Whitcomb whispered once, tears clinging to her lashes. "Our escape." Lady Montrose reached for her hand. "Our necessity." The plants around them swayed gently, leaves trembling as though listening to the confessions of their keepers. Outside, the world continued as usual. Carriages passed, chimneys smoked, the city breathed. But inside the conservatory, the women drifted further from the realm of the living and deeper into that silvery half-consciousness they had come to crave. Sometimes the maids glimpsed the aftermath. They found the women emerging from the conservatory with unsteady steps, veils pulled low. Their eyes held a glazed sheen. Their voices carried the strange, airy softness of someone waking from a dream they did not wish to leave. Rumours began to spread. Servants whispered of the luncheon society, though no food was ever involved. Footmen muttered about women staggering slightly as they returned to their carriages. A gardener swore he smelled something sweet and foreign in the conservatory long after the ladies had departed. Still, nothing was said aloud. The women were too well bred, too influential, too untouchable. And so the secret luncheon society flourished beneath the city's oblivious gaze, an elegant congregation bound not by tea or conversation, but by shared surrender to the sweet vapour they believed offered them peace. A peace that was slowly consuming them. In Lady Montrose's conservatory, orchids bloomed, ferns unfurled, and London's most refined women drifted ever deeper into the fragrant fog of their own undoing. The notion that ether addiction belonged solely to the delicate nerves of Victorian women was a convenient fiction one London's gentlemen clung to with a mixture of pride and blindness. They liked to imagine themselves immune to such weaknesses, fortified by business, politics, and the stern rationality expected of their sex. But London was a city of shadows, and shadows rarely observed the boundaries of class or gender. In truth, the men were drifting too. Jonathan Ashmore had always been the portrait of composure. Tailored waistcoats, polished boots, a punctuality bordering on obsession. He managed his affairs with the brisk efficiency of a man convinced he was in full command of his world. But beneath that polished exterior, cracks had begun to form. It started with sleepless nights not from emotional strain, but from long hours at the office, suffocating expectations, and the creeping dread that success was slipping just out of reach. He returned home late, his temples throbbing, his thoughts tangled. The gaslights felt too bright, the silence of the house too loud. One night, he found Eleanor's bottle in her dressing room. He hadn't meant to look for it. He had only wandered in to retrieve a ledger he thought he'd left on the writing desk. But when the lamplight touched the glass, it gleamed like a jewel, a deceptively innocent thing. The scent hit him first. Sweet, cool, comforting in a way that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. He lifted the bottle, turning it over in his hand. The blue label caught the light, its script crisp and inviting. He hesitated, then inhaled. The relief was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. The tightness in his chest eased, the knot of thoughts loosened, the world softened by half a degree. He exhaled slowly, placing the bottle back where he found it. The next night, he returned for it. Soon, Eleanor wasn't the only one asking Mr. Pritchard for refills. But gentlemen, unlike their wives, had no need for secrecy. They simply explained the purchase away. Long days at the office. A minor ailment. My doctor recommended it. No one questioned a man's request. No chemist dared refuse. Jonathan visited the shop weekly. Then twice weekly, he adopted a new habit of lingering in his study after dinner, claiming the need to review documents, though he often did nothing beyond holding the bottle beneath the lamplight and breathing in its intoxicating sweetness. Late one evening, as London slept under a blanket of fog, Eleanor tiptoed to his study to show him a letter that had arrived from her sister. She paused at the door, her breath caught. Jonathan sat slumped in his armchair, the bottle tilted toward his face, the ether drifting around him like a mist. His eyes were half-lidded, his expression strangely peaceful but vacant. "Jonathan?" she whispered. He startled, dropping the bottle. It rolled across the carpet, bumping gently against the leg of the desk. He scrambled for it, cheeks flushing. "It's not what you think," he blurted. But Eleanor only stared, horrified by the mirror he had become. "You said it was just for my nerves," she murmured. He swallowed. "I needed help too." Those 4 words, the first honest ones he had spoken in weeks, hung between them like a cold draught. In that moment, Eleanor felt a strange mix of fear and validation. She was not alone. Her weakness was his weakness. And yet the revelation brought no comfort. They were both unraveling, and they were unraveling separately. While the women drifted through luncheons and conservatories in a fog of shared indulgence, the men surrendered to their own private rituals behind study doors, in office drawers, at gentlemen's clubs, where the sweet scent mingled with cigar smoke and brandy. Jonathan was not the only one. Sir Alden Pembroke, head of a prominent financial firm, used ether before every negotiation. Mr. Finchley, a magistrate known for his stern pronouncements, kept a bottle in his waistcoat pocket. Young Mr. Holloway, newly come into an inheritance, inhaled before he found the courage to speak in public. London's gentlemen believed themselves discreet, but servants saw the bottles, wives smelled the sweetness. Clerks noticed the sudden, dazed expressions, the hesitation in voices once so firm. The epidemic was not feminine, it was universal, yet no one dared say it aloud. A gentleman's private supply remained private, his hidden indulgence, his quiet collapse. His respectability allowed him to drift without consequence. But consequences were coming. For in the parlors and drawing rooms of London, husbands and wives sat across from one another, both drifting toward the same silent abyss, neither willing to admit it. And as winter pressed its cold palm against the city, the sweet scent of ether curled through both halves of society. The women who floated publicly, the men who crumbled privately. A city of half-dreamers now doubled, and no one dreaming knew how to wake. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow prided himself on his composure. His consulting rooms were havens of calm, where the soft tick of the mantel clock and the faint fragrance of rosewater gave the illusion that every ailment had a tidy cure, every distressed patient a simple explanation. For years, he had believed himself a steady hand guiding London's anxious upper class. But by the winter of that strange, drifting season, even he could no longer ignore the pattern forming before his eyes. It began with Mrs. Whitcomb. She arrived at his office, wrapped in furs, her cheeks flushed unnaturally, her pupils far too wide in the gaslit room. She clutched her reticule with white-knuckled intensity, her breath quickening, though she insisted she was simply a bit overwrought. "Doctor," she said, attempting a smile that wobbled precariously, "I still cannot sleep. My nerves, they feel as though they are humming." Dr. Harrow observed her quietly. "How much of the vapor have you been using?" "Quite sparingly." She lied with the confidence of someone who believes charm will compensate for truth, only when needed. But her hands trembled with unmistakable familiarity. He prescribed a mild tonic, wrote it in elegant script, and sent her on her way. Yet when she stood to leave, she staggered. That was the first moment his confidence faltered. 2 days later, Lady Montrose arrived, reeking faintly of sweetness beneath her perfume. She appeared serene, too serene, her smile soft and vacant. "I find myself drifting at times," she admitted in a whisper, as though confessing a sin. "But only briefly. Nothing of concern. Her eyes unfocused mid-sentence. This time, Dr. Harrow felt something cold twist beneath his ribs. By the end of that same week, Eleanor Ashmore entered his rooms, and everything fell into place. She moved like a woman underwater, her steps too light, her gaze too distant. The winter sunlight filtered through the curtains and fell upon her cheekbones, now sharper than before. Her voice was fragile when she spoke. "Doctor, I don't feel as I once did. How long has your sleep been troubled?" he asked gently. "A while," she murmured. "How often do you use the vapor?" Her eyes flickered. "Only at night." He knew this was false. He could see it in the tremor of her eyelashes, the faint glaze upon her gaze, the odd sweetness clinging to her gloves. The bottle she produced from her reticule was half empty. She had purchased it only 4 days earlier. He held it between his fingers, studying the familiar blue label with a heaviness he had never felt before. "Mrs. Ashmore," he said quietly, "this substance is not meant for such frequent use." She swallowed. "But you—" "Yes," he interrupted, his voice faltering slightly. "I recommended it, but not like this. Not," he hesitated, "not to become a companion, not to become a necessity, not to hollow out the women of London like dolls made of porcelain and vapor." Eleanor's lips trembled. "I can stop whenever I wish." The sentence was spoken with the brittle stubbornness of someone clinging to the last thread of denial. Dr. Harrow felt a shiver of dread move through him, because she believed it. They all believed it, and he had helped them believe it. He dismissed her with gentle instructions and a promise to review her case soon. But once she had gone moving with that eerie, floating lightness, he remained seated, staring at the empty space she had left behind. He opened his desk drawer. It was filled with blue-labeled bottles, rows of them. He shut the drawer with a quiet finality and pressed his hands to his face. His breath trembled. He had thought himself a healer, a man of progress guiding London through the modern age. Instead, he had become the quiet architect of an invisible epidemic. The next morning, he visited Mr. Pritchard's chemist shop. The bell chimed as he entered, and the chemist looked up with his usual bland cheerfulness. "Dr. Harrow, another refill?" Dr. Harrow stared at the shelves behind him, rows of glistening bottles, ready to be sold without question, without caution. Something hardened in his gaze. "No," he said softly. "Quite the opposite." But even as he spoke the words, he knew the truth. It was too late for warnings, too late for reprimands, too late for the calm, steady reassurances he once offered so effortlessly. London was drifting, and he had seen the truth too late. For the first time in his long career, Dr. Harrow felt the sharp, undeniable fear that he no longer understood the sickness consuming his patients. Nor did he know how to stop it. The morning light crept into the Ashmore bedroom like a timid visitor, soft, hesitant, diffused through sheer curtains that fluttered with the faintest winter draught. It was the sort of light that should have felt gentle, almost hopeful, but, for Eleanor, it arrived as a stranger. She woke with a start. Not in the usual way one wakes from sleep, but with a jolt, an abrupt, disorienting return to consciousness that left her trembling beneath the coverlet. For several seconds, she didn't recognize the ceiling above her, nor the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel, nor the delicate embroidered roses on her pillowcase. She sat up slowly, clutching the sheets. What day was it? Had she slept at all? How did she get into bed? Her mind answered none of these questions. The room felt wrong, skewed, as though parts of the night had been gently lifted away and hidden from her. Her heartbeat pounded at her temples, echoing in the hollow spaces where memories should have been. She rose unsteadily, crossing the room with the ghost-like caution of someone navigating a dream, wearing another woman's skin. The vanity was the first clue. One of her hairpins lay broken on the carpet. A bottle of perfume had tipped onto its side, its glass stopper missing entirely. And there, at the center of the disarray, was the ether bottle, its cork abandoned on the floor, its contents lower than she remembered. Her breath caught. Had she used it once or twice? Or several times? Had she spoken to anyone? Had she left her room? A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Ma'am?" came Clara's voice, hesitant but gentle. "Shall I bring tea?" Eleanor hesitated. Her voice emerged in a rasp. In a moment, Clara paused outside the door. She had overheard the pacing in the small hours, the muffled thud of something falling, the eerie silence that followed. Now, the trembling quality in Eleanor's voice confirmed her fears. Inside, Eleanor pressed her palms to her eyes, as though trying to draw the night back through sheer force. Nothing came. She moved toward the window in a daze. Outside, London stirred with its usual morning grace, chimney smoke rising in polite curls, milkmen rattling their carts, a distant church bell marking the hour. But Eleanor felt as though she were watching it all from enormous distance. Her reflection in the glass startled her. Her hair was tangled, not with sleep, but with agitation. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the pupils too wide for morning. Her skin appeared almost translucent in the winter light. She looked like a woman who had wandered somewhere far from herself and only just stumbled back. Downstairs, Jonathan ate his breakfast with unbothered efficiency, reading the paper while the maid replenished his coffee. He barely glanced at the empty chair beside him. "She's sleeping late," he remarked casually. But Clara, pouring his tea, lowered her gaze. "Ma'am was awake most of the night," she whispered. Jonathan didn't hear her, or chose not to. Upstairs, Eleanor paced the length of the room, her nightgown brushing the floor like trailing fog. She attempted to anchor herself by recalling the previous evening, but her mind remained a blank canvas with a single smudge, the faint sweetness of ether clinging to her skin. She knelt beside the vanity, her hands shaking as she righted the fallen perfume bottle. Her gaze drifted unwillingly toward the blue-labeled glass. "It can't go on," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. She reached out, fingers hovering. Just last night, it had felt like salvation, a breath to quiet her nerves, a moment of peace when the world became too sharp. But now, in the cold clarity of morning, it appeared sinister, an accomplice to the theft of her own memories. The doorknob turned. "Eleanor?" Jonathan's voice carried the brisk impatience of a man inconvenienced. "Are you coming down?" She scrambled to her feet. "In a moment." He nodded and left. The door closed. Silence returned. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, the room spinning faintly around her. She pressed her fingers to her temples, her breath shallow. The night was gone, not blurred, not softened, gone like pages ripped from a diary, leaving only jagged remnants. She shivered, because deep down, beneath the denial and drifting haze, she understood that this morning was not the first with missing hours. It was only the first she could no longer explain away. Outside, the winter sun rose higher, brightening the room with indifferent warmth. Inside, Eleanor Ashmore sat trembling on her bed, a woman haunted not by what she remembered but by what she never would. And in the vanity drawer, the ether bottle waited in perfect silence, as though it too knew she would return. The portrait hung in the Ashmore drawing room, a full-length likeness of Eleanor painted 3 years before she first touched the blue-labeled bottle. Visitors always paused beneath it, praising the artist's skill, marveling at the delicate shading, the warmth of her eyes, the effortless grace with which she seemed to step out of the canvas. She had been radiant then. Her skin glowed with youthful vitality. Her posture captured that rare combination of elegance and ease. Her hands, steady, soft, unburdened, rested lightly on the back of a carved chair. Her gaze held a quiet brightness, the sort that made people say she looked alive with promise. But now, Standing before the portrait in the dim winter light, Eleanor felt she was looking at a stranger, or worse herself, but from a life that no longer belonged to her. She traced a trembling hand over the frame. Had it truly been so recent? Had she really been that woman? A faint nausea crept up her throat. Behind her, the drawing-room crackled with the low murmur of the fire. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows with quiet persistence, as though seeking entry. Inside, Eleanor's reflection shimmered faintly in the glass covering the portrait, pale, thinned, hollowed around the eyes. A withering echo of the woman immortalized before her. She stepped backward instinctively, as if making room for the former version of herself to breathe. Clara entered silently, carrying a tray of tea. The girl paused when she noticed Eleanor frozen before the portrait, her expression a mix of reverence and horror. "Ma'am?" Clara asked gently. Eleanor did not turn. Was I truly so beautiful? Clara blinked, taken aback. She set the tray on the table. "You still are, ma'am." Eleanor let out a soft, brittle laugh. "No. Don't lie, Clara. I see what I look like." Clara hesitated, then stepped closer. "You've been tired, that's all." But even as she said it, her eyes flickered toward the vanity drawer in her memory. She remembered the scent in the bedroom, the tremors in Eleanor's fingers, the fragile, drifting way she moved. And Clara knew tiredness alone could not hollow out a woman so quickly. Eleanor finally turned away from the portrait, rubbing her arms against a sudden chill. "Jonathan thinks I simply need rest, fresh air, a change of scenery." Clara lowered her gaze. "Does fresh air help?" "No," Eleanor whispered. "Nothing helps." She crossed the room and sank into a velvet chair, curling her fingers into the fabric to stop them trembling. The firelight danced over her features, casting shadows beneath her cheekbones, deepening the hollows under her eyes. The contrast between the painted Eleanor and the living one felt like an open wound. That afternoon, the Whitcombs arrived unexpectedly for tea. Mrs. Whitcomb entered the room first, her eyes landing instantly on the portrait. "Oh, Eleanor," she sighed, "you look exactly the same." It was the kind of thoughtless kindness society offered without listening to itself. But Eleanor caught the flicker in Mrs. Whitcomb's expression, the quick, startled glance at her face, the faint tightening of her mouth when Eleanor stepped into the light. The lie hovered between them, fragile and obvious. Lady Montrose, who followed, fared no better at hiding her reaction. She paused before Eleanor, with a fleeting look of alarm, quickly masked with an overbright smile. "You must take better care of yourself," she whispered softly, before kissing Eleanor's cheek. Their visit was short, their concern poorly concealed. Their whispers began the moment they reached their carriage. "She's fading. She looks so dreadfully thin. Her eyes, there's something wrong." But no one said the word addiction, not even to themselves, not even when the truth stared at them from the painted canvas. Later that evening, after the guests departed, Eleanor returned to the portrait alone. She stood before herself as she once was, and felt a profound sorrow settle in her chest. Not because she missed her beauty, but because she missed the certainty she saw in those painted eyes, the grounded presence, the brightness untouched by the creeping fog now clouding her mind. Tears gathered but did not fall. "I want her back," she whispered. But the other Eleanor, the one sealed in oils and varnish, looked past her, serene and unreachable. And the bottle waiting upstairs, cool and sweet, offered its own answer. Not her back. Only escape. Only drifting. Only forgetting. Eleanor closed her eyes. And the portrait of her withering beauty watched silently, a haunting reminder of a life slipping through her trembling fingers. Dinner had once been the predictable heartbeat of the Ashmore household, a precise ritual of courses and conversation, punctuated by polite laughter and the gentle scrape of silverware against fine china. In those evenings, Eleanor had moved with the unspoken rhythm of society's expectations, her posture straight, her manners immaculate, her voice clear and melodic. Guests had admired her wit, her elegance, the perfect balance of charm and restraint. Tonight, however, everything seemed askew. The dining room glowed with the soft warmth of gaslight, a golden haze resting over the polished mahogany table. Candles flickered, casting shadows that danced across the patterned wallpaper. Jonathan Ashmore presided at the head of the table with his usual air of controlled authority, discussing business and politics with a brisk efficiency that suggested nothing could ruffle him. But as he glanced across to Eleanor, he could not conceal a faint tightening in his jaw. Something was wrong. Eleanor sat stiffly, gloved hands resting in her lap. A fine porcelain plate lay untouched before her, a neatly arranged portion of roast pheasant and winter vegetables that would have delighted her palate on any other evening. She blinked slowly, lips pressed into a thin, practiced line. Jonathan prompted, as he always did, "Eleanor, shall we begin?" I am not particularly hungry this evening," she murmured, her voice carefully modulated, though it trembled imperceptibly. A servant waited with a silver platter, their hand poised to serve. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Not hungry?" he asked. "You barely touched your luncheon earlier. Is something amiss?" "No," Eleanor replied softly. "It is simply, I had a rather heavy tea." The explanation was inadequate. He sensed it, though he did not press further. Society taught men discretion in the matters of women, and discretion had become a shield for the creeping dread he could now sense. Across the table, Mrs. Whitcomb and Lady Montrose exchanged subtle glances, both familiar with the peculiar pallor and distant gaze Eleanor now wore. They had learned the language of half-truths, the art of speaking without speaking. Words were chosen carefully, excuses formulated meticulously. A faint headache, a restless night, the chill in the dining room, all were plausible, easily accepted by polite society. But no amount of civility could disguise the tremor in Eleanor's hands when she reached, ever so lightly, for the silver cutlery. A slight quiver betrayed the hours spent pacing her bedroom, inhaling the vapor that softened her mind but hollowed her body. Jonathan watched, heart tightening. He had not seen her like this before, so withdrawn, so delicate in the wrong sense. His own pulse quickened, though he refused to acknowledge it. This was a subtle illness, one he could neither name nor fix with the authority he wielded so effortlessly elsewhere. Eleanor, sensing the scrutiny, forced herself to smile. "Please, do not concern yourself. I assure you, I am quite well." Her words hung in the air like a fragile veil, too thin to cover the truth. The room, filled with polite conversation and the occasional clink of cutlery, seemed suddenly unreal. The flickering candles cast long shadows across the walls, stretching and bending, as though the house itself sensed the quiet fracture in its mistress. By the end of the first course, Eleanor had offered no more than a few dainty bites. She excused herself frequently, ostensibly to adjust her gloves, her shawl, or the hair at her nape. Each trip away from the table was a soft, rehearsed act. But Clara, hovering in the background, I noticed the subtle sweetness clinging to her mistress, the telltale trace of the ether that now defined Eleanor's existence. The dinner continued, carried along by formality and custom, but Eleanor's presence had already become a study in absence. Her body sat at the table, but her mind had long since floated elsewhere, caught in the pale haze of sweet vapor and the soft, endless night from which she could not yet wake. By the time the dessert was set before her, she had mastered the art of smiling without engagement, nodding without thought, whispering politeness without conviction. Each excuse was perfect, rehearsed, and entirely insufficient to disguise the reality. The woman who had once presided over the household with radiant composure now existed in fragments, carefully held together only by the invisible threads of habit, propriety, and the sweet, deceptive power of ether. The servants cleared the table silently, and Jonathan continued his conversation, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the woman beside him had begun to vanish, bit by quiet bit, behind her own trembling façade. Jonathan Ashmore had always considered himself a man of order. Punctual, precise, attentive to every ledger and letter, he believed in the authority of reason above all else. He trusted the rhythms of the day, the cadence of society, and the fine balance between propriety and indulgence. But lately, an unease had begun to press against him like a shadow crawling along the walls of the drawing-room, a shadow he could neither ignore nor name. It began with small, almost imperceptible signs. Eleanor, once radiant and composed, now hesitated at steps she had traversed 100 times. Her hands trembled when lifting the teacup he had placed so carefully in front of her. Her eyes, once so vivid, now seemed distant, as though a portion of her mind were elsewhere, invisible to the world. Jonathan noticed, though he told himself it was nothing, winter fatigue perhaps, the relentless social season, stress, all plausible explanations for a woman of her station. But the explanations failed to satisfy. At breakfast one morning, he observed her pause mid-sentence, as if searching for the memory of the word she intended to speak. Her hand lingered over the butter dish, quivering slightly, and for the first time he caught the faint, lingering sweetness in the air. It was subtle but unmistakable, a scent that did not belong in the otherwise orderly household. He leaned back in his chair, a cold weight settling in his chest. He could not bring himself to ask. The question would carry implications he was not ready to confront. Yet the thought would not leave him. What had she been doing in her private rooms? Later that evening, after hosting a small gathering, Jonathan returned to his study, ostensibly to review correspondence. The house was quiet. Footsteps from the servants' quarters had faded, leaving only the soft crackle of the fire. Yet he was unable to settle. A part of him remained tethered to the drawing-room, to Eleanor, to the faint sense of dislocation he could not name. Finally, unable to endure the suspicion any longer, he ascended the staircase, pausing outside Eleanor's bedroom door. He heard the soft rustle of fabric, a chair scraping lightly against the polished floor, and then a muffled gasp. Jonathan's hand hovered over the brass doorknob. Every instinct of propriety screamed for him to retreat, to trust that all was as it should be. But another instinct, sharper, colder, urged him to open the door. Inside, Eleanor sat at her vanity, the blue-labelled bottle beside her, uncorked. Her shoulders trembled. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table as though it were a lifeline. The faint sweetness in the air swirled around her like mist, and for a moment Jonathan was certain he had walked into a dream rather than a room in his own house. "Eleanor," he said quietly, voice breaking the spell of silence. Her head jerked slightly. Her eyes met his, wide and startled. I only," she began, but faltered, voice catching. Jonathan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He swallowed, struggling to maintain his composure. "How long?" She could not meet his gaze. Her lips trembled. I cannot sleep." He understood then, with a clarity that chilled him, that this was no mere insomnia, no simple ailment of nerves or stress. The faint, sweet vapor lingering between them, the hollow gaze, the trembling hands, all spoke of a dependency he had long suspected but never dared name. Jonathan sank into the chair beside her. His hand reached instinctively, brushing hers in quiet solidarity. "You must tell me everything," he said, voice firm yet gentle. "I cannot help if you hide it." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she had not realized were there. I thought I could manage," she whispered. "I thought I could stop." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You are not alone," he said softly. "Whatever this is, we will face it together." The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of winter wind outside. The blue-labelled bottle sat on the vanity, indifferent, a silent witness to the first glimmer of suspicion that had finally grown into recognition. For the first time, Jonathan Ashmore suspected everything, and yet, he realized, suspicion alone was powerless. The truth was now before him, and the real work, the work of confronting the creeping, quiet shadow in his home, was only beginning. Clara had served the Ashmore household for nearly 2 years, and in that time she had learned the rhythm of its daily life. The precise moment the footman polished the silver before breakfast, the way the clock in the drawing-room dictated the pacing of tea, and the delicate subtleties of Mrs. Ashmore's moods. But recently, something had shifted, and Clara could feel it with a weight that pressed at her chest like the winter fog that hung heavy over London. It began with small signs she could not dismiss. The faint sweetness clinging to the air in Eleanor's bedroom, subtle and almost floral, that did not belong to soap or powder. The trembling hands that she had observed but never dared mention, delicate and precise in their movement, yet quivering like leaves in an unseen wind. The pauses, the distant glances, the sudden absences from the drawing-room, as though her mistress had slipped into another world without leaving a trace. Clara tried to tell herself that it was mere fatigue, the toll of social obligations, or perhaps a passing illness. She repeated the explanations to herself with every step she took through the polished halls. Yet the unease persisted, a quiet, insistent echo that would not be ignored. One evening, after the household had retired for the night, Clara was tasked with delivering a tray of tea to Eleanor's room. She paused at the door, noticing that it was slightly ajar, a detail that unsettled her, though she could not immediately explain why. The faint glow of the gas lamp inside revealed Eleanor's silhouette, slumped over the vanity, a hand brushing idly across the smooth surface of the blue-labeled bottle. The air smelled unmistakably sweet. Clara's chest tightened. She knew that smell. Not the perfume Eleanor applied in the mornings, not the floral notes from the drawing-room orchids. This was something different, something cold and consuming, something that made the fine air of the bedroom feel heavy, almost oppressive. Clara's instincts screamed at her to leave, to retreat into the safety of propriety, to pretend she had not seen a thing. Yet she could not. Her eyes flicked to the trembling fingers brushing the bottle, the hollow gaze reflected in the vanity mirror, and the faint, almost imperceptible movements of a woman trying to steady herself in a world that had begun to slip away. She entered quietly, placing the tray upon a side table with careful precision, careful not to disturb the fragile rhythm of the room. "Your tea, ma'am," she murmured. Eleanor's head lifted, but only just. Her eyes flicked toward Clara, briefly, and then fell again, unfocused, distant. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling. Clara remained, standing in the doorway, heart hammering. She wanted to speak, to ask, to demand that her mistress explain the faint sweetness, the trembling, the vacant stare. Yet the words lodged in her throat, heavy with fear and the weight of her station. Servants were meant to obey, not intervene. As she turned to leave, she caught a movement from the corner of her eye, the small cork rolling softly across the carpet, as if pushed by an unseen hand. She froze, listening to the soft hiss of the vapor curling in the air. Clara's thoughts raced. How long had this been happening? How many nights had Eleanor paced the bedroom alone, inhaling the vapor, floating somewhere beyond the reach of memory or rest? How many others in the household, in the city, were slowly surrendering to this invisible, sweet-smelling shadow? The tray of tea sat untouched, the candle flickered, the room smelled faintly of flowers, powder, and something sharper beneath it all. Clara's unease grew heavier, pressing against her chest, filling her lungs with the cold reality of what she had witnessed. She knew, with an instinct born of long service and careful observation, that the household had become a fragile house of secrets, and that within it, Mrs. Ashmore, or what remained of her, was slipping further into a private, drifting haze, one that no gentle words, no polite assurances, could reach. Outside, London slept beneath a cloak of fog. Inside, Clara crept quietly back down the stairs, carrying her unease like a second skin, knowing that what she had seen in the Ashmore bedroom that night would not easily leave her. The household, so meticulous, so ordered, now contained a truth she could neither erase nor ignore: the slow, intoxicating dissolution of a life within these walls, and the heavy, sweet shadow it left behind. Young Clara Ashmore had never been expected to notice such things. At 12 years old, she moved through the grand halls of Belgrave Street with a mixture of curiosity and caution, obeying the unspoken rules of decorum, always careful not to overstep the boundaries set by her mother, her father, and the silent expectations of society. Yet, on a winter afternoon, her innocence collided with a truth she was far too young to comprehend. It began in the nursery. Snow pressed against the windows, frost etching delicate patterns across the glass, and Clara, wrapped in a thick shawl, played quietly with her dolls. She had finished her lessons early and was wandering aimlessly when she noticed the slightly ajar door to her mother's dressing room. Normally, it was locked. Normally, it was forbidden. But curiosity, tempered by a child's naive caution, drew her closer. She pushed the door just enough to slip inside, her small hand brushing the latch. The room was warm, lit by the soft glow of a gas lamp. Eleanor's gowns hung on racks, silk and velvet catching the light with subtle opulence. Perfumed air mingled with something else, something strange, faint and sweet, curling through the room like a whisper. Clara paused, her breath catching, and then she saw it. The blue-labeled bottle lay on the vanity, tipped slightly as if abandoned mid-use. Its cork rested on the polished surface, faint traces of liquid glimmering in the lamplight. Clara's small fingers itched to touch it. She knew, instinctively, that it was important, that it was forbidden, that it carried a power she could not yet name. "Mother?" she whispered softly, her voice trembling despite the need for quiet. No answer. She took a careful step closer, mesmerized by the faint vapor rising in delicate curls, the way it seemed to catch the light like smoke in a quiet fireplace. Her young mind tried to make sense of it. Medicine, perhaps? Perfume? Something for the nerves? Something that made grown-up people behave strangely? Her pulse quickened as she remembered the nights she had spent, listening from her room, the soft footsteps pacing the floorboards, the muffled gasps, the subtle sound of her mother's voice, half-formed, floating through the hallways. And now the object responsible for those nights lay within reach. Clara's small hands hovered over the bottle. A part of her wanted to hide it, to remove it from the room, to deny its power. Another part, a darker, more curious part, wanted to touch it, to understand it, to see what secret it held. The sound of footsteps startled her. She froze. The nursery door creaked, and Clara darted back, retreating into the shadows. She watched as Eleanor entered, moving with the fragile, drifting grace of someone caught between consciousness and dream. Her mother's eyes, glassy and distant, rested briefly on the bottle, fingers hovering above it, before she gently set it back into place. Clara's chest tightened. She understood, in a way that startled her, that the bottle was both a comfort and a cage, that it offered a sweetness she could not grasp, but also a danger she could already sense. She slipped silently back into the nursery, her mind racing. She could not tell anyone, not Jonathan, not the servants, not even a friend. The household ran on appearances, on propriety, on the careful illusion that nothing was wrong. And yet Clara would remember, always. That afternoon, London's winter sun glimmered weakly through frosted panes. The city hummed with its usual rhythm, oblivious to the quiet destruction unfolding in one of its grandest homes. Inside Belgrave Street, a daughter had discovered the secret of her mother's drifting nights. A blue-labeled bottle, small and innocuous, held more power than any child should ever witness. And Clara understood, with the unspoken clarity of youth, that some truths were dangerous simply because they could not be spoken aloud. The house was silent, the lamp flickered, and the sweet vapor lingered, curling in the corners like a pale, invisible spectre, waiting for the next hand, the next breath, the next willing surrender. Mr. Alfred Pritchard had long believed that discretion was the foundation of his trade. His chemist shop, tucked neatly on Grosvenor Lane, had always been a place of quiet propriety. The shelves, lined with glass bottles of all shapes and hues, gleamed softly in the lamplight. Perfume and camphor mingled with the faint tang of chemical tinctures, creating an air of calm reassurance. For years, customers, ladies with trembling hands, gentlemen of faint disposition came and went without question, and Pritchard had been content to supply what they asked for. Until the winter months of that particular season. The pattern had begun subtly. A lady would appear alone, eyes distant, voice hushed. She would select a bottle with meticulous care, pay in coins that rattled softly against the counter, and leave, gliding into the foggy streets as if she were already elsewhere. Occasionally, a gentleman arrived, quietly acquiring a bottle for reasons he could not or would not name. Pritchard never questioned them. Business was business. His smile, soft and measured, never faltered. But one morning, unease settled upon him with a weight he could not ignore. He observed Mrs. Ashmore enter, a figure of grace and fatigue, her gloved fingers clutching a reticule as though it contained a fragile secret. She moved slowly, eyes glassy, voice barely above a whisper. Pritchard filled her request without a word, but as she left, the faint, sweet vapor clung to the air like smoke curling from a lamp. He inhaled it unconsciously, and for a moment, the lightness of the morning office shifted into something unnerving. He realized, with a prickling in his spine, that it was no longer just a medicinal smell. It was the scent of dependency, of minds quietly untethered. Later that afternoon, a young lady arrived accompanied by her maid. The girl's hands shook as she retrieved the coins, her eyes darting nervously to the shelves and then back at her mistress. The blue-labeled bottle, so innocuous in appearance, now seemed almost sinister under the lamplight. Pritchard had filled countless requests for this very concoction, but today he noticed something he had never acknowledged: the pattern. Each visitor, more frequent, more pale, more hesitant, each inhalation leaving a faint, lingering sweetness that clung to their hair, their gloves, their very being. By evening, he observed another gentleman, previously robust and brisk, entering the shop with an air of tentative expectation. His hand lingered over the bottle longer than necessary. Pritchard had seen countless hands grasp bottles over the years, but this was different. The weight in the eyes, the hesitation in the posture, something deeper than habit. Pritchard dusted the shelves mechanically, trying to maintain the rhythm of propriety, yet the unease remained. He could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. The city's finest women and men were coming to him repeatedly, seeking solace in this small vial of vapor, and in doing so they were becoming something else, fragile, distant, half present, half dreaming. He recalled Mrs. Ashmore's last visit, the tremor in her fingers, the faint glassiness in her eyes. He recalled Lady Montrose's hurried departures from the shop, gliding into the foggy streets without acknowledgement of the world around her. He recalled the subtle sweetness that now seemed inseparable from the chemist's own air, an invisible signature of a quiet epidemic. Pritchard closed the shutters early that evening, the shop quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock. He placed a hand upon one of the blue-labeled bottles, feeling its weight, and a cold realization gripped him. For years he had asked no questions, smiled politely, and supplied whatever was requested. Now he understood that silence was complicity. Outside, London's fog pressed against the window panes. Inside, the shelves gleamed with deceptive order. And Pritchard, alone with the bottles and the knowledge he could no longer ignore, felt the first tremor of genuine fear. The epidemic was no longer abstract. It was living, breathing, and moving through the city with every pale, drifting visitor who crossed his threshold. And he, the chemist who had asked no questions, could feel the weight of the truth pressing on his conscience. In the salons of Mayfair, reputation was everything. It floated above the fog-shrouded streets, delicate as cobwebs, glinting in the candlelight of grand ballrooms and drawing rooms. A single misstep, a faint blush at the wrong moment, a whisper of scandal could undo years of careful cultivation. Ladies of quality guarded their social standing as fiercely as they polished their jewelry or folded their gloves with meticulous care. But when a certain sweetness began to drift through the city like an invisible perfume, even the most careful façades began to falter. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. At the Harbury luncheon, Eleanor Ashmore had neglected her plate entirely, offering polite excuses about an earlier tea or a slight chill that made her appetite wane. Lady Montrose had smiled faintly, nodded, and said nothing, though a flicker of alarm crossed her eyes. Guests, eager to maintain the illusion of perfect composure, murmured reassurances. She has been overworked. A passing fatigue. The season weighs heavily on her. But whispers have a habit of stretching thin. They crawl along the edges of gossip like frost across glass, and soon the explanations that once sufficed began to crack under scrutiny. A week later, at the Whitcomb ball, Eleanor appeared as poised as ever, yet her eyes betrayed her. They were dulled, glassy, and distant, reflecting the warm candlelight only in shadow. Those who knew her well, a few close friends, observant servants, noticed it immediately. Her hands trembled when adjusting her gloves. Her laugh, once bright and effortless, now came in soft, uncertain bursts, fading too quickly, leaving an echo of unease in its wake. Society noticed. They whispered behind fans and veils, careful to maintain the charade of civility. "Did you see Eleanor Ashmore at the ball?" a visitor would murmur. "She looked unwell." "She seems thinner somehow," another would reply. "Too pale, and there is a strange fragility about her now." Yet no one said the word aloud. Not yet. Not in public. To do so would have been ruinous, an admission that even the most refined circles were vulnerable, that the carefully orchestrated dance of etiquette and propriety was beginning to unravel. But the shadows of scandal moved faster than the polite masks of society. Servants whispered among themselves, carrying tales of trembling hands, vacant eyes, and subtle, persistent sweetness clinging to gowns and gloves. Footmen and maids alike began to anticipate Eleanor's fainting spells, her wandering absences, and her long, silent nights. Their murmurs, filtered through the invisible lattice of class and discretion, reached ears that were never meant to hear them. Jonathan Ashmore, outwardly composed, noticed the subtle changes as well. He explained them away in the polite language of Victorian propriety. Stress, fatigue, the season, nerves. Yet even he could not completely ignore the hollow gaze and slight tremor that accompanied his wife. By the end of the season, the whispers had begun to take form. Guests who had once admired Eleanor's wit and charm now approached her with cautious deference. Invitations were issued with care, adjusted to avoid prolonged observation of her behavior. Luncheons were shortened, tea parties postponed, and balls attended briefly, if at all. And in the quietest corners of the city, behind veils and lace, a singular understanding had begun to form. The reputation Eleanor Ashmore had spent years cultivating, her grace, her charm, her place at the pinnacle of London society, was teetering on the edge of collapse. It was not a spectacular fall. There were no shrieks of scandal or abrupt expulsions from drawing rooms. Instead, it was subtle, slow, and relentless, a reputation fraying at its edges, eroded by whispers, tremors, and the quiet, pervasive sweetness that clung to her inescapably. Outside, the London fog pressed against the windows, indifferent to the fragile world inside. Candles flickered, curtains swayed, and Eleanor Ashmore, unaware of the full extent of the subtle calamity around her, sat at her vanity, hands trembling, eyes distant, a single blue-labeled bottle waiting within reach. Society watched, waited, and whispered as a carefully crafted reputation began to unravel, thread by quiet thread. Eleanor Ashmore had once believed herself to be mistress of her own desires. She had moved through the drawing rooms and boudoirs of Mayfair with the careful grace expected of her rank, controlling every gesture, every glance, every word. But the blue-labeled bottle on her vanity, small, innocuous, unassuming, had quietly rewritten the rules of her existence. It offered relief, it offered comfort, it offered a fleeting release from the incessant pressure of society, from the expectations of perfection, from the relentless pulse of propriety. Yet in that relief, a cage had formed. At first, it was nearly imperceptible. One inhalation at night, after the household had retired, to calm the nerves and quiet the mind. A second, following a particularly tedious luncheon, to steady the trembling hands. Each small indulgence seemed harmless, even necessary. It was a friend, a confidant, a secret that soothed. But as the weeks passed, Eleanor began to notice its demands. Not loud, not abrupt, its requirements were subtle, insistent, like a whisper she could not ignore. The hands that had once been steady now shook ever so slightly when the bottle was absent. Thoughts that had once flowed freely now caught on themselves, fleeting and broken. Sleep became a stranger, patience a fragile thread that frayed with alarming speed. She rose early one morning, pale and hollow-eyed, and approached the vanity. The bottle gleamed under the lamplight, its blue label catching a shard of gold from the rising sun. Eleanor's fingers hovered over it, a mixture of longing and fear in her touch. Without it, the world felt sharper, harsher. With it, the edges softened, yet her reflection blurred, unfamiliar and unsteady. Clara, peeking from the nursery doorway, noticed the pattern with a child's unclouded perception. Her mother's eyes, once luminous, now flickered like candle flames in a draught. The tremor in her hands, the slight unsteadiness in her step, the way she lingered over the vanity as if tethered to some invisible cord, all spoke of a slow, inescapable dependence. Eleanor inhaled the ether, letting its sweetness drift into her lungs. The room softened, the firelight became gentler. The chill in the air receded, and for a moment she believed herself free. But the cage was not in the room. It was not in the walls, nor in the glass of the bottle. The cage existed in the invisible threads that had woven themselves into her mind and body, unseen and unstoppable. Each breath she took made her lighter, yet bound her ever tighter. Every sip, every inhalation, promised relief while quietly chaining her to it. By evening, when Jonathan returned from his club, Eleanor appeared composed, yet Clara had seen enough. She noticed the slight glaze in her mother's eyes, the way her fingers brushed the reticule almost instinctively. She understood, without needing words, that the very substance meant to soothe her mother's nerves was now defining them. Eleanor moved through dinner with careful precision. She smiled, she nodded, she spoke when required. But behind each gesture, each carefully chosen word, the invisible bars of her dependency pressed against her. She was awake, yet drifting, alive, yet tethered, polished, yet fractured. The evening passed in quiet ritual, the house humming with ordinary sounds, the clink of silver, the murmur of servants, the distant tolling of a church bell. But inside Eleanor, the cage tightened imperceptibly. The bottle rested within reach, blue and gleaming, a silent jailer offering the sweetest, most deceptive comfort. And so she sat, poised, elegant, and utterly trapped her freedom, stolen by a friend she could not refuse, a companion she could not abandon, and a cage she could neither see nor break. Outside, London glimmered in the fog and lamplight, indifferent to the quiet imprisonment of one of its finest women. Inside, Eleanor breathed in the sweetness and exhaled the last remnants of herself. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had kept meticulous records for decades, believing that careful observation, measured prescriptions, and precise notation were the foundations of proper medical practice. Every patient had a file, every symptom a careful description, every remedy a line of neat, legible script. Yet never before had his notes felt like confessions. It began, as most realizations do, quietly. He reviewed the entries for Mrs. Whitcomb, Lady Montrose, and Eleanor Ashmore in the flickering lamplight of his private study. Their visits were recorded with the same meticulous attention to detail he afforded all patients. Date, time, description of complaint, prescribed remedy, and follow-up. But reading them now, he noticed a pattern that had escaped him until this late hour. One line followed another like a secret unspooling. Tremors in hands, pallor in cheeks, insomnia noted repeatedly, fainting incidents occurring with increasing frequency, subtle hints of cognitive disorientation. Every entry was precise, clinical, unemotional, but beneath the ink, a narrative had begun to form, one that terrified him with its clarity. He leaned back in his chair, gaslight flickering across the rows of bottles lining his shelves. The blue-labeled vials, once mere containers of a soothing vapor, had quietly become the axis around which these lives now turned. Patients returned again and again, seeking the comfort of the substance, and he, the ostensibly rational physician, had supplied it without question, without hesitation, without warning. Harrow's own hand trembled as he wrote a note for Eleanor's next visit. Observe for tremors, pallor, delayed responses. Encourage minimal use of ether. Assess mental acuity carefully. Consider alternative rest methods. The words felt hollow on the page. Minimal use? Could he truly enforce such restraint? Would she, or any of the women he treated, heed his careful instructions when the vapor promised escape from the relentless pressures of their world? He remembered Mrs. Whitcomb's most recent visit vividly. Her gloved fingers had trembled as she handed over coins. Her eyes had been glassy, unfocused. She spoke softly of restless nights, yet she clutched the bottle as though it were a lifeline. And Lady Montrose, too, she had lingered far longer than necessary, inhaling lightly before leaving, her steps unsteady, her composure intact only in the polished exterior she presented to the world. Eleanor Ashmore's notes were the most alarming. Tremors, insomnia, fainting, pallor, vacant gaze. Harrow had observed subtle improvements after brief rest, only for the symptoms to recur with increasing intensity, and each recurrence had been accompanied by a note in his own hand. Requires reinforcement of dosage limits. Monitor carefully. Observe psychological state. Careful observation. Monitor. Limits. The phrases now sounded hollow. Words on paper, intended to guide and protect, had failed. Harrow set down his pen and pressed his forehead against the cool mahogany of his desk. He had always prided himself on knowledge, on insight, on the ability to anticipate and prevent harm. Yet here he sat, aware that the very measures he had instituted were insufficient. Worse, his own inaction, his failure to intervene more forcefully, to ask questions, to refuse the repeated requests, had become part of the problem. He could no longer deny it. The epidemic was quiet, invisible, and deeply entrenched. The women of Mayfair, with their delicate hands and pale eyes, had become prisoners of a substance he had provided, trusting in its apparent safety. Outside, London's fog pressed against the windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the city's grand houses. Inside, Dr. Harrow sat in silence, the weight of his own complicity pressing upon him. He reopened the folder and began to write again, this time with a careful, deliberate hand. Observations, warnings, reflections, private notes he would never read aloud, words meant to confront a truth too dangerous for the polite society to acknowledge. For in the quiet, flickering lamplight, the doctor understood a bitter reality. Knowledge alone could not undo what had been set in motion, and his meticulous notes were the only testament to the slow, invisible destruction quietly consuming the women entrusted to his care. By the late winter of that season, Eleanor Ashmore had begun to vanish, not entirely, of course, but in a manner more complete than mere absence could explain. She moved through her home with the careful precision of one practicing the art of invisibility. Footsteps were light, eyes lowered, hands clasped delicately in her lap as though seeking to contain themselves. Guests arrived, and she smiled, spoke, nodded, but there was a pale distance in her presence, a drifting detachment that was impossible to reconcile with the vibrant, commanding figure she had once been. Society noticed. Always, society notices. At first, the whispers were polite, cloaked in the language of propriety. Mrs. Ashmore is delicate this season. She tires easily in the cold. One must excuse her absence from the Harbury luncheon. But the excuses grew thinner, with each passing week, fraying at the edges until only the faintest trace of civility remained. By midwinter, the Ashmore name in social circles had begun to take on a curious, hushed quality. Invitations were sent, but often declined. Hostesses spoke of Eleanor's indisposition, and husbands murmured, "She requires rest." Yet when Eleanor appeared, her eyes were glassy, her posture fragile, her voice polite but distant. There was no malice, no theatrics, only the quiet, creeping reality of a woman slowly disentangling herself from the world. Clara, watching from the nursery window, understood more than anyone else in the household. Her mother had become a shadow among the living, moving through rooms and corridors with the same soft elegance but entirely absent vitality. Her hands trembled when she poured tea. She drifted past mirrors without recognition. She spoke in polite cadences, but the words no longer belonged entirely to her. Even Jonathan Ashmore, accustomed to the rhythms of propriety and the art of discretion, noticed the change. He attempted gentle encouragements, invitations to the drawing room, whispered requests for conversation at dinner. Eleanor complied with the outward trappings of etiquette, yet he could feel the soft resistance in the pauses, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes sometimes failed to meet his. The servants, too, whispered among themselves. Clara had overheard them discussing the fainting again, the pale eyes, the strange sweetness that clung to the air in the bedroom. They did not speak the word aloud, but they all understood it. Mrs. Ashmore was slipping, quietly, irrevocably, from the ordered world in which she had once moved with such certainty. It was during a rare visit from Mrs. Whitcomb that the extent of the disappearance became clear. Eleanor arrived for tea, gliding into the parlor with the measured poise of one who had practiced every gesture countless times. Her gloves were immaculate, her gown carefully arranged, her hair pinned with precision. Yet the conversation lagged. Her responses were delayed, hollowed by some internal fog. She sipped tea and smiled, but the spark, the one that had once animated her presence, was gone. By evening, when the Whitcombs departed, the parlor felt emptier than it had when they arrived. The laughter that once filled the room seemed to fade more quickly. Eleanor moved to the window, staring out at the foggy streets below, and for a moment she seemed entirely absent, present in body only, her mind elsewhere. Outside, London carried on, indifferent to the quiet, vanishing. The carriages rolled, the lamps flickered, and the fog curled around the buildings like a soft veil. Inside, a woman had begun to withdraw from every social expectation, every polite obligation, every smile she had once given freely. And yet, the blue-labeled bottle waited on her vanity, silent and patient, promising the soft haze she craved, while quietly consuming the woman she had once been. Eleanor Ashmore, radiant and admired only months before, now existed as a careful shadow. She moved, she spoke, she complied with expectation, but the vibrant, commanding presence she once embodied had slipped through the fingers of propriety and into the quiet, fragrant fog of dependency. The society that had celebrated her beauty and wit now watched in polite silence as she disappeared, drifting, untethered, and ever further from the world she had once commanded. It happened on a night that was meant to be ordinary. A small dinner at the Harringtons, a gathering of polite company, each guest carefully rehearsed in the manners and rhythms expected of their station. London had been draped in fog for days, the gas lamps casting halos through the mist that softened the edges of the streets and cloaked the city in quiet ambiguity. Inside the Harrington drawing room, warmth and candlelight mingled with the subtle fragrance of winter blooms, creating a space where conversation could flourish, gossip could be whispered, and the burdens of propriety could be carried without complaint. Eleanor Ashmore entered on Jonathan's arm, as poised as ever, or so it seemed. Her gown shimmered in muted gold, trimmed delicately with lace that caught the lamplight with gentle precision. At first glance, she appeared entirely composed, the perfect hostess of her own presence, a woman whose elegance and refinement were the envy of London. But it was the first glance that deceived. By the time the first course was served, the mask had begun to slip. Eleanor's hands trembled as she lifted her napkin, her grip faltering on the fork she attempted to hold with the grace society demanded. Her eyes, though trained to meet those of her companions, flickered constantly, never settling, as if each gaze threatened to reveal something she could not bear to disclose. Her friend, Lady Montrose, seated opposite, caught the tremor in Eleanor's fingers and the slight hollow in her expression. She glanced at Mrs. Whitcomb, who nodded ever so slightly in silent acknowledgement. Both had seen this before. The subtle collapse of a carefully constructed façade, the beginning of a slow and imperceptible unravelling. The servants, attentive and discreet, murmured among themselves in hushed tones. The faint sweetness of ether clung to Eleanor's gloves, a delicate, almost imperceptible trace that whispered of the private rituals she had employed in the shadows of her rooms. One of the footmen paused mid-step, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, sensing that this was no ordinary evening, that the polished veneer of polite society was about to crack. And then it happened. A laugh, a small, faint sound escaped Eleanor's lips. But it was wrong, thin, brittle, lacking the warmth and vitality that had once defined her presence. She raised her teacup, intending to sip, and it trembled in her hands. The liquid sloshed over the rim, spilling faintly onto the tablecloth. Conversation faltered. Eyes turned toward her, polite concern brushing against curiosity. Jonathan's brow furrowed imperceptibly. He had long suspected, long observed, but tonight, in the soft glow of candlelight, the evidence was undeniable. His wife, radiant and poised only moments before, was unraveling before him. The mask she had worn so expertly for months, hiding the tremors, the vacant gazes, the nights spent adrift in a haze of vapor, had finally begun to fall away. Eleanor looked around the table, her eyes meeting one friend, then another, and the weight of her own vulnerability pressed upon her. The polite laughter, the carefully curated conversation, the gentle nods of approval, none of it mattered. She could no longer maintain the illusion. Her composure fractured, and for the first time in weeks, those who had long known something was wrong glimpsed the truth in full. The ladies nearest her exchanged subtle glances, a mix of sympathy and alarm, while the men, including Jonathan, remained outwardly composed, though the change did not escape their notice. The room, once a sanctuary of civility and elegance, felt suddenly heavy, suffused with the quiet tension of unspoken acknowledgement. And Eleanor, trembling, realized that nothing, no gown, no mask, no careful gesture could conceal her collapse. The ether that had soothed, that had promised calm, had also bound her, and now, In the warm candlelight, the bindings became visible to all who cared to see. The night ended not with scandal, but with the fragile, piercing clarity of truth. The mask had fallen. The façade was gone. Eleanor Ashmore, for the first time, existed not as the perfect lady of society, but as a woman laid bare, vulnerable, tremulous, and painfully human. Outside, the London fog pressed against the windows. Inside, the drawing room held its breath, witnessing the quiet unraveling of elegance, the moment when pretense could no longer withstand reality. By the following morning, the soft, suffocating calm of Mayfair had been pierced. News travelled quickly in London, faster than the gentlemen's horses clattering along cobblestones or the whispering maids conveying half-truths from household to household. A single, carefully worded article appeared in one of the early editions of the morning papers, a brief, subtle paragraph buried between notices of auctions and carriage sales, but its impact spread like ink dropped into water, seeping into every drawing room and parlour that prided itself on discretion. It is noted with some concern that Mrs. Eleanor Ashmore of Belgrave Street was observed exhibiting signs of considerable fragility at the Whitcomb Winter Ball last evening. While society accepts delicate constitutions, repeated faintness and apparent nervousness have led to whispers among those present. The paragraph was polite, almost perfunctory, yet the insinuation was unmistakable. London society read it as both a warning and a spectacle. Newspapers rarely needed to state the obvious. The implication alone was sufficient to unravel reputations. By 10 o'clock, the gossip had begun. Gentlemen read the paper aloud over breakfast, murmuring, half-comprehending phrases about delicacy and nerves, while casting furtive glances at their wives. In households across the city, the sentence echoed beneath the polite clinks of teacups. Repeated faintness and apparent nervousness. At the Ashmore residence, Eleanor sat at her dressing table, the morning sun catching the fine dust of powder along her cheekbones. She held the paper in her hands, fingers trembling slightly, eyes tracing the words as though each letter were a small accusation. She had anticipated gossip, yes, but this public acknowledgement of her failings shook her more deeply than any quiet observation from a friend or maid. Clara, watching from the threshold, recognized the subtle tremor in her mother's hands and the faint catch in her breath. She understood the significance of a society woman's reputation being addressed, even so delicately. In print, the paragraph was an invisible blow, a public reminder that even the most refined facades could be penetrated, that whispers in the corridors and subtle glances in drawing rooms were no longer confined to private spaces. Jonathan Ashmore entered the room, his expression carefully neutral. He glanced at the newspaper lying on the dressing table. "I see," he said quietly, though the flatness in his voice betrayed the unease he felt. "It seems the city is taking note." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I suppose," her voice trailed into a whisper, "I cannot hide it any more." Jonathan, who had long suspected, nodded slowly. There was no anger, no reproach, only a profound, aching understanding. The subtle tremors, the glassy eyes, the faint sweetness that clung to her skin, all had led to this point. By mid-morning, the Ashmore house received discreet visits from acquaintances bearing the same concern, their smiles tight, their questions cautious. "We hope she is well," one lady murmured. "Perhaps rest will restore her." "Vigor?" Another offered invitations to dinners, though with a faint hesitation, as though each visit might reveal something scandalous, something unspeakable. Even servants moved differently, aware of the change in the air. Clara sensed the tension, the unspoken acknowledgement that their mistress was now a subject of public scrutiny. The household, once carefully ordered and protected, had been touched by the invisible hand of notoriety. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, indifferent to the lives of the Ashmores. Carriages rattled over the cobblestones, Market cries echoed through alleys, and the fog drifted lazily across the city, masking both streets and secrets. But inside the Belgrave Street residence, the morning papers had done their work. Reputation, once carefully cultivated over years of polish and precision, now teetered on the edge. The subtle scandal, couched in decorous language, had pulled back the curtain, and Eleanor Ashmore, her hands trembling over the newspaper, realized that the eyes of society, always present, always judging, were finally upon her in full measure. The cage she had constructed for herself with polite manners, inhalations of ether, and disciplined composure had been breached, and the world, even if politely, had begun to see what lay within. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had remained silent for months, bound by his reputation, his discretion, and the quiet complicity of polite society. In his polished consulting rooms on Bruton Street, he had watched the subtle decline of his most esteemed patients, the tremors, the pallor, the hollow glances, the faint, persistent sweetness that lingered in their hair and on their gloves. He had recorded their symptoms meticulously in private notes, observed the frequency of their visits, and prescribed mild tonics with careful hands. But words spoken aloud were dangerous, and society demanded silence. Until that morning, it began with a letter, addressed in the careful hand of Lady Montrose. It had arrived folded in cream stationery, sealed with a delicate stamp. "Dr. Harrow, I entreat your counsel. The situation grows beyond my understanding." Her words trembled ever so slightly beneath the formality, betraying the deep anxiety she felt for her friend Eleanor Ashmore. Harrow read the letter in his study, the lamplight catching the faint furrows of concern etched across his face. He had known the time for discretion had passed. The subtle decline of the women he treated had become too evident, the whispers in society too pervasive, and the consequences too grave. He summoned a small circle of concerned friends and colleagues in his private study, doctors, confidants, men and women who understood the delicate balance of reputation and health. The room smelled faintly of candle wax and polished wood, but beneath it lingered a subtle tension, as if the very air awaited confession. "My friends," he began, voice measured yet carrying an urgency he had rarely permitted himself, "I have been silent too long. I have watched, recorded, and observed, yet I refrained from speaking because discretion demanded it. But discretion has failed. Our patients, our society, requires honesty." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "Eleanor Ashmore is unwell. Mrs. Whitcomb, Lady Montrose, and others of their circle are likewise affected. The substance they have been using, ether, has grown beyond mere medicinal use. It has become dependency. It alters the mind, the body, and, I fear, the very essence of their being." A murmur ran through the room. Faces that had been calm, practiced, and polished now carried the faint flush of shock. Even seasoned physicians exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the enormity of what Harrow revealed. "They have been inhaling it in secrecy," he continued. "At first, for rest, for calm, but the effect is cumulative. Their hands tremble, their speech falters, their eyes lose the clarity that once distinguished them. The world outside the polite society in which they move with perfection is at risk of witnessing the consequences, whether they like it or not." One of the attending physicians, a young man of keen observation, spoke quietly. "Surely we can intervene with caution, offer substitutes, restorative regimens?" Harrow shook his head. "Caution alone is insufficient. The pattern is entrenched. To remain silent now is to permit further harm, both to the individuals and to the society that regards them with admiration and trust. They will be observed, and the world will notice the decline even if we remain silent." The room grew heavy with quiet contemplation. The doctors, normally masters of calm detachment, felt the gravity of the epidemic pressing against them. The faint, sweet scent of ether seemed to hang in the study, though none present had inhaled it. Finally, Harrow spoke again, voice lower, almost a whisper. "I must break my silence publicly. The city must understand the consequences of this private indulgence. Otherwise, the decline will continue unchecked, and reputations, lives, and the health of these women will be irreparably damaged." He leaned back, exhaustion and resolve mingling in his expression. He had waited too long, as all good intentions delayed by propriety often do. The decision to speak, though fraught with social peril, was inevitable. Outside, London's fog pressed against the windows, indifferent to the quiet confession unfolding within. Inside, Dr. Harrow prepared himself to shatter the delicate veneer of society with the truth he had long withheld, knowing full well that once spoken, discretion would no longer shield anyone from the consequences. And, for the first time in months, the doctor felt a faint, uncomfortable relief, an acknowledgement that some truths must be revealed, no matter how elegantly they have been concealed. The revelation did not arrive with the quiet decorum Dr. Harrow had hoped. It crashed into London society like a sudden winter gale, scattering the carefully maintained illusions of propriety and grace. Within hours of his disclosures, whispers had become conversations, and conversations had become speculation, and speculation, when carried through the drawing rooms and tea tables of Mayfair, became a quiet panic. The city, ever vigilant in matters of appearances, reacted with its customary blend of curiosity and horror. Gentlemen, gathered in clubs and offices, leaned over the morning papers, murmuring in low tones about tremors, fainting, and hollow eyes. "Have you noticed it yourself?" one would ask another, gloved fingers drumming a gentle rhythm on the polished wood of the table. "The ladies at the ball last evening paler than usual, almost absent." Ladies, meanwhile, met in private parlors, fluttering fans, shielding expressions of alarm. They compared notes: who had skipped luncheon, who had trembled at tea, who had not touched her plate. The scent of gossip, so delicate and pervasive, drifted more readily than any perfume could. Every whispered remark carried weight, every glance became a coded inquiry into the hidden maladies of the upper class. At the Ashmore residence, the effect was immediate. Invitations were returned with the faintest excuses, delivered in handwriting that trembled slightly despite careful composition. Housekeepers whispered urgently among themselves. Footmen paused mid-step, exchanging concerned glances. Even Jonathan Ashmore, who had long attempted to maintain a façade of control, could not ignore the subtle scrutiny of neighbours and acquaintances. Clara, observing from her vantage at the nursery window, noted the unusual activity. Servants hurried quietly to ensure that the household presented an impeccable front. Curtains were drawn, rooms tidied to an almost obsessive perfection, and yet, beneath the polished surface, an undercurrent of fear moved like a tide. She had heard the whispers downstairs, the careful murmur of concern when the name Eleanor Ashmore arose in conversation. She understood, instinctively, that the world outside the house had begun to recognize the hollowing effect that had taken root within. Across London, the subtle tremors became more than personal ailment. They became an object of public anxiety. Society relied upon the illusion of elegance, of control, of perfect composure. When these illusions faltered, even faintly, the reaction was swift. Hostesses cancelled soirees, citing unexpected obligations or seasonal malaise, while salons remained empty under the polite pretense of personal discretion. Invitations were withdrawn or carefully reworded to avoid placing any lady in a position where her fragility might be observed. At Harrington's ball, once the epitome of refinement, conversations faltered mid-sentence as the topic of Mrs. Ashmore arose. Gentlemen coughed discreetly. Ladies adjusted their fans with nervous precision. The orchestra's strings, though perfectly tuned, seemed to play a melody slightly off, as though the very air anticipated collapse. And all the while, the faint, sweet scent that had once clung only to certain private rooms now hovered subtly in the awareness of the city itself, a ghostly trace of private indulgence now made public through whispered rumor and the careful observation of those who always noticed such things. By evening, Mayfair had entered a state of quiet alarm. Conversations were carefully measured, glances exchanged with subtle calculation, and polite concern became the currency of the hour. No one spoke openly of addiction, for propriety forbade such a word, yet everyone understood it. They understood that the women most admired, most envied, were not entirely in command of themselves, that beneath their polished facades the shadows of dependence had taken hold. And within the Ashmore household, Eleanor remained drifting, unaware of the storm her very presence had begun to stir. The bottles on her vanity gleamed in the lamplight, innocent and patient, while outside the city hummed with quiet panic, the social order momentarily suspended under the weight of unspoken truths. London, as ever, carried on, but beneath its cobblestones and fog, a tremor had begun, a tremor that would not be easily soothed. As London stirred with the first uneasy whispers of scandal, the Ashmore household, like many others, became a theatre of quiet conflict. The polite panic that swept through society manifested not in public dramatics, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible struggles that unfolded behind closed doors. In homes bound by etiquette, servants and masters alike waged silent wars of observation, discretion, and intervention, each battle measured by restraint rather than overt declaration. Eleanor Ashmore moved through her home as though encased in glass. Her steps were deliberate, her voice soft and measured. Yet behind her composed exterior, the tremor of dependency dictated every motion. She walked past the nursery window with a slow, wavering gait, aware of Clara's small, observant eyes tracking her movements. The child had learned to interpret glances, gestures, and the faint, lingering scent of ether that clung like a ghost to her mother's gowns. Clara, too young to intervene outright, began to act with the careful stealth of someone playing a game with invisible rules. She carried out tasks with exactitude, observing without speaking, noting patterns and absences. She saw the subtle hesitations in her mother's hands, the half-forgotten gestures, the moments when Eleanor would drift from one room to another without clear purpose. Each observation weighed heavily on the child, a burden too complex for her years, yet impossible to ignore. The servants engaged in their own battles. Footmen whispered discreetly in hallways, their voices carefully modulated to avoid detection, comparing notes on the number of fainting spells, trembling hands, and unexplained absences. Housemaids exchanged coded glances when blue-labeled bottles were delivered or left unattended. Even the cook, whose domain was the kitchen, noted the irregularity of meals left untouched, the careful, deliberate pacing of a mistress who no longer entirely belonged to the household she once commanded. Jonathan Ashmore, observing from his study, sensed the tension, yet remained constrained by societal expectation. He understood that overt confrontation would be improper, that to challenge his wife directly about her private habits would risk exposure, embarrassment, and a breach of decorum. Instead, he watched, measured, and intervened only with the slightest of guidance, suggesting rest, encouraging meals, or offering gentle conversation, each action calibrated to maintain appearances while attempting to protect Eleanor from herself. Even the simple acts of daily life became fraught with silent negotiation. Tea was poured with caution, chairs were arranged to minimize accidental contact, and every gesture was imbued with layers of unspoken meaning. Eleanor herself became both participant and observer, aware of the watchful eyes around her, yet unable to resist the pull of the ether. She moved with careful precision, masking tremors and fatigue with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to perform while fading from the world simultaneously. In neighbouring houses, similar dramas unfolded. Lady Montrose paced her rooms under the pretext of arranging flowers, while servants whispered among themselves about fainting, sleeplessness, and tremors. Mrs. Whitcomb, retreating from her own drawing-room, conducted private rituals to steady her nerves, knowing that the eyes of her household were both ally and adversary. Across London, the city hummed with its familiar rhythm, carriages clattering, shopkeepers calling, children laughing in alleyways, but within each household, the quiet wars persisted, unseen by the outside world. They were battles of concealment, of observation, of whispered intervention. The dependents, the observant, and the servants all participated in a delicate choreography, striving to preserve dignity, maintain appearances, and yet contend with the subtle, pervasive influence of ether. In these homes, the battles were silent, but the stakes were immense. Reputation, health, and the fragile equilibrium of society itself teetered on the edge, held precariously by the whispered vigilance of those who dared to notice, and the quiet, desperate surrender of those they served. And in the corners of Belgrave Street, the faint sweetness of ether lingered, a constant reminder that the wars waged behind closed doors were far from over. Alfred Pritchard had been silent for far too long. For decades, he had served the women and men of London with courtesy and discretion, providing remedies without question, administering doses without hesitation, and watching as polite society carried on oblivious to the quiet consequences. The blue-labelled bottles, small and unassuming, had become part of the city's unspoken rituals. They were requested, supplied, inhaled, and tucked away with perfect propriety, and Pritchard, the reliable chemist, had asked no questions. Until one dreary afternoon in February, when the bell above the door chimed and a familiar figure entered. Eleanor Ashmore, wrapped in a pale shawl, gloves slightly rumpled, moved with that floating, uncertain gait he had come to recognize. Her eyes were dull, glassy, and distant, her lips pressed into a line of careful control. She approached the counter with the same practiced air of composure, but Pritchard noticed the faint tremor in her hands, the subtle hesitation as she placed the coins upon the marble. "Another bottle, Mrs. Ashmore?" he asked, voice gentle, polite. Eleanor nodded, reaching for the familiar vial, but Pritchard paused. For the first time in years, he hesitated. He studied her face, the slight hollowness of her cheeks, the glassiness of her gaze, the tremor in her fingers as she hovered over the counter. And then he spoke words he had never allowed himself before. "I cannot give you this again." Eleanor froze. The delicate veil of composure she maintained faltered. Her eyes widened, lips parting in quiet disbelief. You cannot?" "I cannot," Pritchard repeated, firm now, though his voice carried a careful softness. "Not until you have consulted a physician, and not until you can demonstrate that it will be used with restraint. You have come too frequently, too dependently. The effects are no longer harmless." A subtle pallor overtook Eleanor's face. Her fingers twitched above the counter as though poised to snatch the bottle, but the words, steady and deliberate, rooted her in place. She opened her mouth, faltering, then closed it again. The world seemed to contract around the edges, the familiar warmth of the shop transforming into a space heavy with unspoken truths. Pritchard continued, "It is not merely a tonic. It alters the mind. It steals sleep, steadies nerves at the cost of autonomy, and leaves you fragile in ways that polite society cannot acknowledge. I have observed the pattern in you and others, and I will not enable further harm." Clara's voice trembled in Eleanor's memory, though she was not present, reminding her that the servants had seen, the children had noticed, and the house itself had grown quiet with tension. Eleanor's body, used to the invisible pull of relief promised by the ether, shivered subtly as though resisting this first confrontation. You are refusing?" Eleanor whispered. "I am refusing," Pritchard affirmed. "Not to punish, not to shame, but because it is necessary. You cannot continue this path unchecked. You must confront the truth of your reliance before it is too late." A hush fell over the shop, broken only by the distant chime of the street bell and the soft rustle of winter air through the door. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the counter, to the empty space where the bottle should have been. The familiar sweetness that had promised relief hovered only faintly, lingering like the ghost of a comfort now withdrawn. Outside, London carried on in its indifferent rhythm, unaware of the small, decisive rebellion that had taken place within a modest chemist's shop. Inside, Pritchard watched Eleanor gather herself, pale and uncertain, the first flicker of recognition in her eyes that her freedom and perhaps her life would require more than the easy succor of a blue-labeled bottle. For the first time, he had refused, and for the first time, he realized that discretion and courtesy had their limits, and that sometimes, to preserve a life, one must break the rules of polite society entirely. It was a damp afternoon in March, the fog curling along Belgrave Street like slow-moving smoke. Eleanor Ashmore had not been seen at public gatherings for weeks, her absence explained politely as delicate health or a need for rest. But within the walls of her home, the truth had grown heavier than ever. The sweet vapor of the blue-labeled bottle lingered faintly in the air, a soft, persistent reminder of dependency and the subtle unraveling it had wrought. That morning, Clara had knocked quietly at her mother's bedroom door. No answer came. The door, usually left ajar at the child's convenience, was now closed firmly, and the faint light beneath it flickered in an irregular pattern. Clara waited, hand trembling slightly, heart tightening. She knew the rhythm of her mother's presence well enough to sense that something was amiss. Eleanor had slipped further from the world. The steps of the house, the murmurs of the servants, the distant laughter of children, all of it passed around her like a breeze she could not grasp. When she finally emerged, it was with the careful poise of a woman performing the final act of a play she no longer remembered rehearsing. Her eyes, pale and glassy, did not meet Jonathan's when he entered the room, and she responded to his inquiries with words that lacked the warmth and certainty they had once carried. Dr. Harrow's recent warnings echoed faintly in Eleanor's mind, though not with clarity. The chemist's refusal to provide another vial, the whispers of servants, the distant disapproval of friends all collided in a haze, leaving her drifting, untethered, and fragile. The world outside the window, the fogged streets, the bustling merchants, the distant clatter of horse hooves felt unreal, as though she observed it from a great height, separated by glass and invisible walls. At the luncheon that afternoon, Eleanor appeared again, dressed in pale blue, gloves pulled tight against her trembling hands. The hostesses greeted her with faint smiles, noting the careful attention to her posture, the precise manner in which she curtsied. But the veil had slipped. Attentive eyes, servants, and close friends alike noticed the subtle tremors, the delayed responses, the faint, sweet scent clinging to her hair and gloves. It was impossible to ignore. The woman they had admired and envied was vanishing before them, body present, but mind adrift. During conversation, Eleanor spoke softly, her words precise but hollow. Questions required effort. Responses were delayed, as though filtered through a mist. Lady Montrose's eyes flicked toward her with quiet alarm. Mrs. Whitcomb, seated nearby, offered polite encouragement, but did not press. The careful balance of civility, of social expectation, now rested on a knife edge. Jonathan watched, a silent ache pressing in his chest. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, the subtle devastation that had overtaken his wife. Yet propriety demanded observation without interference. The delicate threads of social expectation held them hostage, even as he feared for Eleanor's health, her autonomy, and her very sense of self. That evening, Eleanor returned to the sanctuary of her bedroom. The blue-labeled bottle rested on the vanity, a patient sentinel. Her hands hovered, trembling, above it. She inhaled, and for a moment the world softened, edges blurred, tensions eased, and the pale warmth of temporary oblivion washed over her. Yet even as the relief flowed, she felt the weight of absence pressing in. Memories of the morning, of conversation, of meals untasted, drifted away. She had slipped, imperceptibly but irrevocably, from the life she had once inhabited. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows of Belgrave Street. Inside, the house exhaled with the faint creaks of its settling timbers. Eleanor Ashmore, once radiant and commanding, had become a presence both haunting and hollow. She was there in body, yet her mind had quietly slipped away, drifting through the sweet haze of the ether into a world only she could inhabit. And in that slipping, the household, the city, and the polite society around her could do nothing but watch, powerless, as the patient who had once embodied vitality and elegance vanished quietly before their eyes. London, as always, continued its unrelenting rhythm. Carriages clattered over the cobblestones, shopkeepers called their wares, and fog drifted lazily along streets lined with polished facades. Yet within the gilded halls of Mayfair, a subtle, pervasive tension lingered, an undercurrent only discernible to those attuned to the fragile pulse of society. Eleanor Ashmore, once the paragon of refinement and poise, had become a quiet spectre, her presence at events perfunctory, her movements delicate and drifting, her eyes glassy and distant. Those who observed her closely could see the telltale signs of dependency: trembling hands, faintly discolored lips, a hollowed gaze. Friends, confidantes, and acquaintances had noticed long before society officially acknowledged it, yet the city, as a collective organism, chose discretion over intervention. Conversations in drawing rooms and parlors were carefully crafted, whispers tempered by etiquette, glances veiled behind fans. No one spoke directly, for propriety demanded silence, and so the delicate decay was permitted to continue unnoticed in public, discussed only in private murmurs. At a luncheon hosted by Lady Harbury, the air was thick with civility. Women in pale gowns moved gracefully among polished tables, their voices low and measured. Gentlemen sipped their brandy and exchanged polite observations. When Eleanor arrived, she did so with all the outward appearances of normalcy. A slight smile, a nod of acknowledgement, hands folded with practiced precision. But beneath the surface, she was drifting half present, half absent, sustained by the subtle pull of the blue-labelled bottle resting in her reticule. Lady Montrose leaned toward Mrs. Whitcomb, whispering, "She is not herself, yet no one will speak of it openly." Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes flickered toward Eleanor. "We look the other way, always. Better to preserve appearances than confront reality." And indeed, that had become the unspoken code. Society chose to ignore what it could not control. The women who once represented elegance, charm, and authority were now defined by subtle tremors and quiet absences. But to question them publicly, to confront the decline, would have invited scandal, speculation, and the collapse of reputations carefully cultivated over years. Outside the room, the servants moved with quiet precision, aware of the fragile atmosphere. Clara, observing her mother from a discreet corner, noted every hesitant gesture, every delayed response, every moment where Eleanor's composure slipped just enough to betray the subtle truth. The child understood the paradox. Those in power chose ignorance, while those who could see clearly were constrained by position, propriety, and fear. Even Jonathan Ashmore, steadfast and careful, understood the silent contract society had entered into. Observe, nod, and permit the pretense of health and vitality. He watched as Eleanor smiled faintly at a passing acquaintance, her hands resting delicately on the table, and he knew the truth that no one dared acknowledge aloud. She was present in body only. Her mind had long since begun to wander into the haze of dependency that society, with its polite conventions, refused to name. As the luncheon concluded and the guests departed with murmured farewells, Eleanor returned to the quiet sanctuary of her home. The drawing rooms, once alive with laughter and conversation, were now suffused with a faint, uneasy stillness. The blue-labeled bottle gleamed faintly on the vanity, patient and unyielding. Society had chosen its course. It would look the other way. It would preserve appearances, cloak concern in the language of propriety, and maintain the illusion of elegance. But in doing so, it had permitted a quiet unraveling, a slow, creeping erosion of vitality that would not be easily reversed. Outside, London slept beneath its familiar blanket of fog, indifferent to the subtle tragedies unfolding behind the walls of Mayfair. Inside, Eleanor Ashmore drifted, unseen and unacknowledged, while society, as always, looked the other way. Even after the gatherings had ended, after the guests had departed with the soft shuffle of silk and polished shoes, the parlors of Mayfair remained alive, with something far more subtle than conversation or candlelight. They were alive with echoes, the quiet, persistent resonance of absence, trembling hands, and vacant eyes. The spaces that had once held laughter now carried a faint, lingering vibration, like the afterimage of music long silenced, or the ghost of perfume clinging to the air. Eleanor Ashmore's presence was particularly poignant in these empty rooms. She moved through the drawing room as though tracing invisible paths, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of tables, the delicate folds of curtains. Every step left a trace in the atmosphere, a whisper of the recent gatherings, a residue of energy that refused to dissipate. The blue-labeled bottle remained on her vanity, its faint sweetness curling faintly through the air like a half-remembered memory. Clara, in her small corner of the household, noticed the echoes most acutely. She would linger near the stairwell or behind the parlor door, listening to the subtle creak of the floorboards beneath her mother's steps, to the faint exhalations of breath as Eleanor moved past mirrors and windows. Clara had learned to read these movements like a language. A pause at the fireplace, a hesitant reach for a chair, a trembling hand brushing against the edge of a table. Each gesture spoke of absence, of drifting, of a presence not fully grounded in the room. The servants, too, felt it. Footmen carrying trays hesitated before entering the parlors, sensing the fragile tension that lingered in the corners. Maids exchanged glances when doors closed too softly, when curtains trembled though the wind had died, when a vase, previously untouched, seemed to quiver as if recalling the presence of hands that had long since departed. They spoke little of it, for discretion remained paramount, but the tension was palpable. Even the youngest members of the household, like Clara, understood that these echoes were signs of something both fragile and dangerous. Outside, London continued its indifferent rhythm. Carriages rattled over the cobblestones, vendors called their wares in the fog, and gas lamps glimmered through the mist, illuminating streets that seemed unaffected by the quiet unraveling within the homes of the upper class. Yet, inside, the parlors remained haunted. The chairs, once warm with conversation and laughter, now seemed to remember the tremors, the silences, the absent attention of their occupants. The curtains, brushing against polished floors, caught the light with a faint, eerie shimmer, as though reflecting not the present but the absence that lingered. Jonathan Ashmore walked through the drawing room with careful steps, noting the faint scent that still clung to the air. He pressed his lips into a line of controlled concern, understanding, as he always did, that no words could fully address the delicate unraveling within his household. He observed the chairs, the tables, the mirrors, and the small traces left behind by Eleanor's movements, knowing that the echoes were as telling as any confession, more revealing than any conversation. Even Dr. Harrow, when he visited briefly, remarked on the subtle, unsettling stillness. He noted it in his private records. The home itself reflects the absence, the tremor, the lingering traces of dependency. The effects are now spatial, atmospheric, unmistakable to those trained to observe. The evening deepened, and the light in the parlors softened to a muted glow. The echoes remained. A chair creaked slightly, as though remembering a hand that had rested upon it. The curtains swayed faintly, holding the ghost of recent movements. And in the quiet corners, the faint sweetness of ether lingered, stubborn and persistent, a reminder that the drift was far from over. London might sleep, oblivious to the subtle decay within, but the parlors of Mayfair carried their own memory. The memory of trembling hands, glassy eyes, half-absent gestures, and the soft, sweet vapor that bound them all together. In those rooms, the echoes would linger long after the voices had ceased, a haunting testimony to the slow, imperceptible unraveling of elegance, composure, and, most tragically, presence itself. The winter fog had begun to lift, though not entirely, leaving London draped in the pale, diffused light of early morning. Streets glimmered with the lingering moisture of melted frost, and gas lamps reflected softly in the cobblestones, lending the city a quiet, dreamlike sheen. The world carried on, as it always did, indifferent to the dramas hidden behind polished doors and shuttered windows. Yet within the grand houses of Mayfair, a truth lingered, unspoken and unacknowledged, the slow, inexorable unraveling of the women who had once embodied the city's elegance, grace, and refinement. Eleanor Ashmore, now a shadow of her former self, moved through her home with deliberate care. Each step was measured, each gesture precise, as if she feared the slightest misalignment would betray her secrets. The blue-labeled bottle rested on her vanity, a silent companion and patient jailer, its faint sweetness curling subtly through the air. She lifted it occasionally, inhaling with the delicate precision she had long mastered, each breath offering fleeting calm but exacting a quiet toll. The city around her seemed unaware or chose to remain so. Invitations arrived and were ignored, social engagements went unattended, and polite explanations were offered to maintain appearances. Delicate health, a need for rest, overexertion, phrases repeated with mechanical precision, each one a shield against inquiry, each one a silent agreement to forget what could not be seen directly. Within the Ashmore household, the echoes of decline persisted. Clara watched from the nursery window as her mother drifted past mirrors, her reflection pale and hollow, hands trembling faintly despite the careful concealment of gloves. The servants moved quietly, attuned to the subtleties of trembling movements, whispered gasps, and the faint chemical sweetness that lingered in the bedrooms long after the mistress had passed through. Their eyes conveyed concern without words. They understood that the house had become a theatre for quiet suffering, one that polite society was eager to overlook. Jonathan Ashmore observed with careful restraint. He noted the changes, the faint vacuity behind Eleanor's eyes, the subtle tremor in her movements, and yet he maintained the decorum required of his station. Questions were measured, interventions restrained, for society demanded that appearances be preserved above all else. The city, too, demanded discretion. Scandal was never spoken aloud, only hinted at in polite whispers that dissipated like morning mist. The blue-labeled bottle gleamed in the morning light, patient and indifferent. It had become the silent axis around which Eleanor's days now revolved. Friends who visited, servants who observed, even Jonathan, all understood that the substance held power beyond its simple, innocent appearance. It offered relief, comfort, and escape, yet exacted a subtle, persistent toll, and the city, ever polite, ever discreet, chose to ignore it, to look away, to preserve the illusion of civility. In drawing rooms, parlors, and salons, the women who had once embodied grace now moved like shadows, their elegance maintained only in surface form. The laughter, the conversations, the gestures, all carefully performed, rehearsed, and contained, masked the quiet, pervasive influence of the substance that had woven itself into their lives. London would speak of nothing, remember nothing, and maintain the delicate fiction of propriety. And so, the secret endured, carefully hidden within the mist of foggy streets, the polished veneers of Mayfair, and the invisible barriers of etiquette. The women continued to drift, the house exhaled in quiet acknowledgement, and the city, polite and indifferent, chose to forget. Eleanor Ashmore, fragile and drifting, raised the blue-labeled bottle once more, inhaled lightly, and exhaled. Outside, London continued to move, its streets humming with life and oblivion alike. Inside, the faint sweetness lingered, a soft, unyielding reminder of the secret that no one would speak, the quiet ruin that polite society had quietly decided to overlook, and the woman who remained, tethered to it, unseen and forgotten.